The sun is falling across the Black Sea now, and the light that touches the limestone cliffs of Crimea carries with it all the weight of slow, tired gold. The stone faces turn amber, then rust, then something closer to ash. If you were standing on those heights overlooking Sevastopol's harbour at this hour, at dusk, when the day is finally relinquishing itself, you would feel the salt air moving in from the water, cool and insistent, carrying the mineral breath of centuries. The cliffs themselves seem to hold the day's warmth even as darkness reaches across the water. Somewhere below, in that sprawling natural harbour where the hills embrace the sea on three sides, the water reflects what little light remains, and you might hear, very faintly, the cry of a gull or the creak of wood against stone. The whole landscape breathes with the kind of quiet that comes only after long struggle, though that struggle, if you listen carefully enough to the undertones of this place, feels less like something past and more like something still echoing. Sevastopol's harbour is a geography lesson written in geology. The city curves around a bay so perfectly formed, so generously protected by its ring of hills and peninsulas, that sailors have been seeking its shelter for more than 2,000 years. The Romans knew it, the Ottomans fought for it, the Tsars built their empire's navy here. And as the sun now surrenders to the evening, you might imagine how many ships have rocked in these waters, how many eyes have scanned these cliffs from the deck of some vessel, arriving at last in this refuge. The limestone rises in terraces and ridges, weathered into 1,000 small canyons by wind and rain. In places, the cliffs are nearly vertical. In others, they slope more gently, offering ravines and gullies where a soldier, or a child, or a donkey might find purchase. The geography of this place is not accidental. It has shaped empires. It has shaped wars. If you found yourself walking these heights in the fading light, you would notice how the harbour below seems to mirror the sky, turning the same shades of grey and blue and deepening purple. The water here is warmer than most of the Black Sea, cradled as it is by these protective hills. Boats move within it slowly, almost reluctantly, as though they too are winding down towards sleep. The buildings of the city, though you would see them only as shapes now, as a loose collection of silhouettes and shadows, cluster along the waterfront and climb the slopes in terraces. Some are modern, some are old. All of them at this hour seem to belong more to memory than to the present moment. The smell of salt grows stronger as evening deepens. It is a clean smell, an ancient smell, untouched by the years of human conflict that have marked this peninsula. And yet there is something else in the air here, isn't there? Something that lingers even now, decades later. There is a presence to this place that goes beyond what the eye can see or the nose can smell. Sevastopol's harbour carries within it the ghosts of far older struggles, wars fought not centuries ago, but merely generations back, within living memory, still for some who walk these streets. The limestone cliffs have witnessed not only the slow erosion of time, but the terrible swift erosion of battle. They have absorbed not only the salt spray of the sea, but the dust and the smoke, and the echoes of an assault so sustained, so relentless, that it has no parallel in the history of modern warfare on this continent. A siege, specifically. A siege that would last 246 days. A siege that would come to be known as Germany's longest assault, an operation so grinding and so costly that both the Germans who undertook it and the Soviets who resisted it would carry its weight forward into their own futures. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, at this dusk hour, with the sun finally surrendering and the temperature beginning its slow descent, there is only the harbour, only the cliffs, only the ancient shape of this landscape. The fortress city sleeps, or appears to sleep, in its embrace of stone and water. The wind moves gently. A few lights are beginning to appear in the buildings below, small and warm and distant. If you were to imagine standing on those cliffs and looking down into the harbour at this exact moment, you might ask yourself, what is it about certain places that seems to collect history within them? What is it about a harbour, about a city built in such a way that it is half protected and half exposed, that draws military attention again and again across generations? Why does Sevastopol keep calling wars to itself? These are not easy questions to answer, and yet they matter because they form the context for everything that is about to unfold in this account. The answer, as is so often the case with such things, lies somewhere between geography and ambition, between the natural world's indifference to human affairs and humanity's relentless determination to reshape that world according to plans drawn up in distant headquarters by men who would never themselves stand on these cliffs in the evening light. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, accounts of long military struggles unfolding across geography, of how terrain and time and human endurance intersect in moments of historical consequence, I'd invite you to subscribe so that you might drift through more of these long-form military history journeys whenever the night calls for it. This is the kind of narrative that reveals itself slowly, layer by layer, and there are many such layers waiting in the archive. But for now, for this moment, we remain suspended here at the threshold. The sun is nearly gone. The harbour below is slipping into deeper shadow, and somewhere in that shadow, waiting to unfold, is the story of how one city became the focus of one of the most sustained military campaigns of an entire war. How a place of such beauty, such ancient refuge, became instead a place of endurance and loss. How geography and history and human will collided here for nearly 8 months, and in that collision, changed the course of events that would ripple outward across continents. The date is October 1941. The year before, in the summer, the German armies had invaded the Soviet Union in an operation of such scale that nothing quite like it had been attempted before. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, aircraft streaming overhead, the assault was meant to crush Soviet resistance in a single, overwhelming thrust. The Wehrmacht was still, at that moment, almost universally regarded as the finest military force in Europe. Its generals had studied the art of rapid movement, the blitzkrieg, the lightning war. They had proven themselves superior in Poland, in France, in Greece. They believed, with a confidence that bordered on certainty, that the Soviet Union could be defeated before winter came. But autumn was deepening now. The snows had not yet fallen, but the light was failing earlier each day, and with it came the first whispers of doubt among some in the German command structure. The Soviets had not collapsed as expected. They had retreated, yes, and surrendered enormous territory, but they had not broken. They continued to fight. They continued to organize. And in the far south, in the Crimean Peninsula, a particular strategic opportunity was opening up, or so it seemed to the German planners. If Crimea could be taken, if the Soviet Black Sea Fleet could be driven from its principal base at Sevastopol, then the entire southern flank of the German advance could be secured. Supply lines could be protected, further operations deeper into southern Russia and toward the oil fields of the Caucasus could proceed with greater security. The Crimean Peninsula itself is a curious geography, a thumb of land, roughly speaking, that protrudes southward into the Black Sea from the Ukrainian steppes. It is connected to the continent by the narrowest of isthmuses. In certain places it is mountainous, particularly in the south. In others it is flat steppe, harsh and exposed. Sevastopol itself sits on the southwestern tip, where the Black Sea folds the peninsula into itself with a series of natural harbours and protected bays. From the heights above the city, if you were to look outward on a clear day, you might see across the water toward Turkey, toward the broader Mediterranean world. It is a place that has always been strategic, precisely because it commands so much of the approach to southern Russia. And as the German armies advanced deeper into the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1941, Sevastopol began to loom larger and larger in the minds of the German High Command as an obstacle that simply had to be removed. The question was how. That question would drive the history of the next 246 days. That question would cause countless thousands of men, German and Soviet both, to endure conditions of hardship that would be difficult, perhaps, for those of us living now, in an age of comfort and relative safety, to truly imagine. The question was how to take a fortress city protected by limestone cliffs, defended by soldiers determined to hold it, and supplied, however tenuously, by a navy that still commanded certain stretches of the Black Sea, even as the German military dominated the air above and the land around. The evening is nearly complete now. If you were standing on those cliffs, you would see only darkness gathering over the harbour below. The first stars, if it is a clear night, would be beginning to emerge. The temperature would be dropping steadily. The wind would be growing colder, carrying with it the first promises of the winter that was coming. And somewhere in that darkness, in the city below, thousands of people would be settling into whatever shelter they had, whatever homes or bunkers or caves they could find, unaware, or perhaps very much aware, that their lives were about to change in ways they could not quite predict or prevent. Change was coming to Sevastopol. Siege was coming. And when it came, it would remake this city, this harbour, this limestone cliffed landscape, in ways that would still be visible, still be felt, even now, in the 21st century, when visitors stand on those same heights at dusk and breathe the same salt air and feel the same strange presence of history that does not quite rest. If you find yourself drawn to these vast, shadowed chapters of history, the kind that unfold across years of stone and snow and human resolve, we invite you to follow us through more of these long-form military journeys. There is something peculiar about tracing a siege from its first encircling movements to its final, quiet aftermath, something that asks us to slow down and witness not just the grand strategy of generals, but the small, repetitive rhythms of those who endured. Each story, like Sevastopol, contains within it 100 smaller stories, 1,000 individual choices made under impossible pressure, and we believe that understanding these moments, truly understanding them, with patience and without rushing, changes how we see the world. When you subscribe, you'll have access to more documentaries that move at this same deliberate pace, that trust you to sit with complexity, to let details accumulate like dust settling after an explosion. There are sieges in ancient Mesopotamia that shaped how humans think about walls and power. There are naval blockades that determined the fate of nations. There are winter campaigns where geography became destiny, where a single valley decided whether an army would advance or fall back into history as a cautionary tale. Each of these deserves to be heard, not in fragments or highlights, but as a complete, unfolding narrative, the way soldiers themselves experienced it, moment by moment, day by day, sometimes hour by hour. The beauty of this kind of historical listening is that it asks nothing from you but your presence and your curiosity. You need not take notes or memorize dates. The arc of the story will carry those details along naturally, the way a river carries sediment downstream. And there is profound rest in that surrender to narrative, in allowing your mind to follow the path laid out, rather than struggling to retain and organize everything at once. As you drift through an account of ancient fortifications or the logistics of maintaining an army through a brutal winter, your conscious mind can relax into the role of witness, while your deeper awareness continues to absorb and process what you hear. We craft these documentaries with the knowledge that the best time to explore history deeply is often when you are most at peace, when the day's demands have fallen away, and you have space in your mind for stories that matter but do not urgently call for action. There is no quiz waiting at the end, no test to prepare for. Instead, there is only the gentle accumulation of understanding, the slow build of empathy for those who lived through these events, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing something true about the world and the people who have shaped it. So if the story of Sevastopol, this fortress city with its limestone cliffs and its harbour full of ghosts, speaks to something in you, we would be honoured to guide you through other sieges, other campaigns, other moments when ordinary human beings faced extraordinary circumstances and found within themselves reserves of courage or endurance, or simply the stubborn will to survive another day. Subscribe now and let us walk together through the corridors of history at the pace that allows you to truly see what lies there in the shadows. The year was 1941, and Adolf Hitler's vision for his empire had turned southward with an intensity that would reshape the map of Eastern Europe. By that autumn, the German Wehrmacht had already driven deep into Soviet territory along the vast steppes of Ukraine, And now the strategic eye of Nazi command fell upon the Crimean Peninsula, that distant, thumb-like landmass jutting into the Black Sea from the south. To understand why Sevastopol mattered so profoundly, it is necessary first to understand what Hitler wanted Crimea to be. Not merely conquered territory, you see, but something far more consequential: a fortress, a naval base, and a stepping stone. The Führer harbored visions of projecting German power across the Black Sea itself, threatening the oil fields of the Caucasus, and eventually establishing a strategic presence that would bend Soviet maritime influence to its will. Crimea, in this grand calculus, was the key that might unlock the entire southern flank of the Soviet Union. Consider for a moment the geography that made this ambition seem plausible to German planners. The Crimean Peninsula sits like a sentinel guarding the northern approaches to the Black Sea. Control Crimea, the logic went, and you control the sea lanes. Deny it to the Soviets, and you remove one of their most important naval bastions. But there was more to it than mere strategy drawn on a map. Sevastopol itself was no ordinary Soviet city. It was, in essence, the home port of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Navy's principal installation in those southern waters. Its harbors, its shipyards, its repair facilities, and its arsenal made it far more than a military objective. It was a symbol of Soviet power, a jewel of Soviet engineering and maritime strength. To take Sevastopol would be to strike a blow that echoed not just through military command, but through the very consciousness of the Soviet state. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, that momentous dawn when Operation Barbarossa tore open the frontier and millions of men began their march eastward, the initial momentum seemed to favor the Wehrmacht almost completely. Soviet forces in many sectors were caught off guard, compressed, sometimes surrounded, as German formations drove south through Ukraine toward the Black Sea region. The possibility of reaching Crimea seemed almost inevitable, the next logical phase of a war that, to German eyes, was progressing according to plan. Yet as summer turned to autumn and the calendar pages fell away, the speed of the German advance, while still formidable, had begun to slow. The vast distances of the Soviet Union were consuming resources. Supply lines stretched and grew ever more fragile. Still, the momentum was there, and by September 1941, German and Romanian forces stood at the gateway to Crimea itself, poised to enter a territory that would become the site of one of the Second World War's longest and most grueling sieges. The prize gleaming before them was not simply military real estate. Sevastopol possessed something more intangible. It was a fortress city with deep historical roots and profound symbolic weight. Built by Russian imperial ambition in the 19th century, fortified and developed over decades, Sevastopol had been a symbol of Russian and then Soviet power on the southern frontier since its founding. Its natural harbor, protected by high ground and numerous defensive works, had been designed and refined through experience and engineering skill. To German commanders like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who would soon arrive to take charge of the assault on Crimea, the city represented both an obstacle and an opportunity. It was an obstacle because its fortifications were formidable, its garrison determined, and its position on high ground made direct assault costly. It was an opportunity because taking it would accomplish so many objectives at once: removing a Soviet fleet base, securing Crimea for German use, and delivering a psychological victory of considerable magnitude to Hitler and his regime. What drew the German command to Crimea with such intensity, beyond even the prize of Sevastopol, was the realm of possibility that its conquest opened. With Crimea secured and Sevastopol in German hands, German strategists envisioned a future in which the Black Sea might become something like a German lake. From such a position, they imagined pressuring the Caucasus further, threatening Turkey, and even, some whispered, potentially establishing a connection with German forces operating far to the south and east. These were ambitious dreams, yes, perhaps even grandiose ones, but they were not entirely divorced from the military realities of the moment. In the autumn of 1941, the German war machine seemed to many observers to be nearly unstoppable. It had humbled France. It had invaded the Soviet Union with apparent success. The idea that Crimea and Sevastopol might fall into German hands seemed not merely possible, but perhaps even probable, to those drawing up the plans in Berlin. The strategic location of Sevastopol itself made it an irresistible target. Positioned on the southwestern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, overlooking the deep, protected harbour that had drawn civilizations to the site for centuries, Sevastopol was not simply a military base, it was the military base. The Black Sea Fleet depended upon it utterly. Without Sevastopol, the Soviets would lose their principal naval installation in those waters, their ability to project power, their capacity to protect their own coastlines and merchant shipping. For a state fighting for survival, the loss of such a facility would be catastrophic. This is perhaps why Soviet command and the political leadership in Moscow viewed Sevastopol's defense with such determination. To lose it would mean conceding vast strategic advantages to the enemy. To hold it, by contrast, would preserve a crucial foothold in the southern theatre and keep alive the possibility of future operations, future offensives, future possibilities. As autumn 1941 progressed, and German forces assembled on the plains of Crimea, the two sides found themselves oriented toward each other, across a landscape that had already witnessed one great siege, that terrible winter of 1853 and 54, during the Crimean War, when British and French forces had laid siege to the same fortress city, and when Russia had learned hard lessons about the cost of defending this strategic position. History, in a sense, was preparing to repeat itself, though on a scale and with a ferocity that would dwarf even that mid-19th century conflict. The Soviet defenders who now garrisoned Sevastopol, the sailors who served in its fleet, the engineers who staffed its fortifications, and the civilian population that inhabited its streets, would soon face an ordeal that would test every measure of endurance and sacrifice. But in that waiting autumn, none could fully anticipate what awaited. The siege that would unfold would become the longest German assault of the entire Second World War, a grinding, relentless struggle that would consume resources, lives, and time in quantities almost incomprehensible to contemplate. For now, though, the Germans gathered their forces, made their plans, and began their advance into Crimea with confidence born of recent victories and reinforced by the reasonable conviction that Sevastopol, whatever its defences, could not long resist the full weight of German military power brought to bear upon it. To understand what drew Hitler's gaze southward, one must first know the city that would soon command his obsession. Sevastopol in the autumn of 1941 was not simply a garrison town or a naval station, though it was certainly both. It was a place layered with memory, with the weight of nearly a century of empires and sieges already written into its very stones. The city had been founded deliberately, methodically, by Catherine the Great's admirals in 1783, built to be a fortress from its inception. The Russian Imperial Navy understood then what Germany would come to understand now, that Sevastopol's natural harbour, carved into the Crimean coast like a cupped hand, was perhaps the finest strategic position on the entire Black Sea. 3 deep bays opened toward the south, protected by narrow entrances that could be fortified, garrisoned, defended against almost any approaching fleet. The harbour itself seemed designed by Providence, or by millennia of patient water wearing through limestone. The Tsarist military engineers who arrived in those early decades of Russian rule did not need to invent defences from nothing. They needed only to improve upon what geography had already provided. By the 1850s, when the Crimean War brought British, French, and Ottoman forces to besiege that very harbour, the fortifications were already formidable. The Siege of Sevastopol in 1853 and 1854 became one of the longest, bloodiest sieges of that conflict, lasting 11 months, consuming tens of thousands of lives, and ending only when the Russians themselves evacuated the city rather than let it fall intact to the Allied powers. The echoes of that older siege lived on in Sevastopol's collective memory, in the names of streets and monuments, in the stories told to children. Every schoolchild knew of the engineer Todleben who had designed the defenses. Every citizen understood, at some level, that their city had been tested before, that it had endured before. And so by 1941, nearly a century after that Crimean conflict, the fortifications had evolved. The old earthwork batteries and naval guns had been superseded by more modern installations, though many of the original Tsarist forts remained, their thick stone walls still capable of absorbing punishment. The Russians had continued to strengthen what they had inherited, adding new concrete positions, gun emplacements, underground magazines and shelters. The Black Sea Fleet called Sevastopol home, and with that honor came constant upgrading, constant vigilance. A Soviet naval base required teeth. But in that particular autumn, as October turned toward November and the days grew shorter and cooler, the city's population was still largely living what might be called ordinary lives. There were perhaps 30,000 civilians in Sevastopol proper at that moment. Workers in the shipyards, dockhands, shopkeepers, teachers, families with children. The war had come to the Soviet Union only 4 months earlier, in June, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa across the vast Russian plains. But Crimea was far from the initial invasion lines. The peninsula seemed, for a little while longer, almost removed from the immense tragedy unfolding to the north and west. The city itself rose in gentle terraces from the harbour, white limestone buildings with red tile roofs, parks and gardens planted along the shoreline. The Tsarist-era naval cathedral still stood, with its golden domes. The seaside promenades were lined with trees and benches. In the cool autumn weather, there was still an almost peaceable quality to the place. Fishermen still went out. Markets still operated. Children still attended school. The naval personnel went about their duties. Shore batteries were manned, of course. One was never entirely at peace on a Soviet military base, but the rhythm was still the rhythm of a garrison town in relative quiet, not yet a place under siege. What is remarkable is how little warning, in a practical sense, most of these people had. The newspapers carried news of the German advance into Ukraine, but the distances were vast. Sevastopol was built on the assumption that it could be supplied and reinforced by sea, and the sea was Soviet territory. It seemed impossible, in October of 1941, that German forces could actually reach the Crimean Peninsula itself. Armies did not simply appear at one's doorstep. There were defensive lines, there were distances, there was time. But time, as it happens, moves with different speeds for different people. For the generals in Moscow and for those in Berlin, time was already accelerating. For the civilians in Sevastopol, walking through their pleasant parks, buying their bread in the shops, listening to wireless reports that still seemed somehow distant, time still moved gently. In a matter of weeks, this would change completely. The pace would quicken. The war, which had seemed so far away, would arrive with shocking abruptness. Yet in those particular weeks of autumn 1941, Sevastopol was still itself, still a city of harbours and whitewashed buildings, and civilians who had never experienced siege, who could not quite imagine what was coming. The fortifications had been built over generations, improved and refined and strengthened. The Black Sea Fleet was still there, still capable. The Soviet Union still held the peninsula. The harbour that had tempted empires for centuries remained Soviet. This was the moment just before the storm. This was Sevastopol as a place still living its peacetime, still rooted in its own history and memory and ordinary routines, and it would not remain so for very much longer. By the autumn of 1941, a commander named Erich von Manstein stood at the threshold of the Crimean Peninsula, his reputation already substantial within the German High Command. Manstein was not a man of bluster or theatrical ambition. He was a mathematician of war, a careful reader of terrain and supply lines, and he understood with an almost intuitive clarity how geography could be turned into strategy. The 11th Army, his command, had been tasked with securing the entire Crimean Peninsula, and it arrived in a region that would demand every ounce of that methodical intelligence. The peninsula itself presented a landscape of stark contrasts. To the north lay the Isthmus of Perekop, that narrow strip of land barely 6 kilometers wide at certain points, which connected Crimea to the mainland steppe. It was here that the first true test would come, a natural choke point where a defending force, if positioned well, might hold back a much larger invading army for weeks. Beyond the isthmus, the land opened into a vast rolling plateau of golden grassland, the steppe that had witnessed countless migrations and conflicts across centuries. This steppe stretched inland from the coast, relatively flat and exposed, offering little natural shelter to either attacker or defender. A commander moving through it would feel perpetually vulnerable, watched from every horizon. But Sevastopol itself lay at the peninsula's southwestern tip, and between the steppe and that fortress city rose the Yaila Mountains, a dramatic spine of limestone and ancient stone that rose to nearly 2,000 meters in places. These mountains were not towering peaks in the alpine sense, but they were formidable nonetheless. They created a second natural line of defense, a barrier of ravines and rocky slopes that would slow any mechanized advance and turn open-field tactics into something far more cautious and grinding. Manstein, studying maps in his headquarters, would have understood immediately that whoever held these mountains held the pathway to Sevastopol itself. The landscape around Sevastopol harbour formed a series of hills and ridges, each one at slightly different elevation, each one capable of being fortified with bunkers, gun emplacements, and observation posts. The terrain there was almost uniquely suited to a defending force, and peculiarly hostile to an attacker who had to move forward against prepared positions. Ravines cut through the city itself in places, creating natural fortifications that turned urban warfare into something that resembled trench combat more than street fighting. Manstein's task, then, was not merely to defeat a retreating enemy, it was to navigate across a peninsula whose very geography seemed designed to multiply his difficulties. The northern approach through the Isthmus of Perekop would be a direct assault, costly and brutal. The southern approach towards Sevastopol would require either a rapid breakthrough before defensive lines could fully harden, or else a siege, and Manstein was astute enough to recognize that a siege in a mountainous coastal region with an enemy that still controlled parts of the sea would be far more complicated than in open terrain. The 11th Army itself, though formidable, was not unlimited in its resources. Germany's military-industrial capacity, for all its sophistication, was finite. Moving heavy equipment across hundreds of kilometers from the northwest, down through the captured territories of southern Russia and into the Crimea, required an elaborate supply chain vulnerable at every point to partisan attack, to exhaustion of logistics, to the sheer distances involved. Manstein would have to be economical with his strength. He could not afford to squander men on frontal assaults if there were alternatives. He could not afford to be delayed indefinitely. The Soviet Union, after all, had vast reservoirs of manpower, and the longer the 11th Army remained tied down in the Crimea, the longer it was unavailable for operations elsewhere along the vast eastern front. One might ask, what calculations must have run through Manstein's mind as he surveyed those maps and considered the terrain reports? How much time would he need? How many casualties might he absorb before the cost became prohibitive? These were not sentimental questions, but practical military ones, and Manstein's genius lay partly in his ability to ask them with cold clarity and to adjust his plans accordingly. The peninsula itself, despite its challenges, held certain advantages for the Germans. It was relatively isolated. Once the Soviet forces were driven south and cut off from the mainland, their ability to receive reinforcement became constrained. The Crimean Peninsula was not a fortress unto itself. It was a peninsula, which meant it could potentially be starved of supplies if German sea power, or the threat of it, could be made credible. The Black Sea Fleet remained formidable, but it was fighting for control of waters that Germany now partially dominated from the air, and the tactical calculus was more complex than it might have appeared from a distance. The German troops themselves, as they arrived in the weeks of October and early November 1941, would have experienced the landscape as both opportunity and obstacle. The climate was already shifting toward winter. The steppe, golden and mild in summer, began to take on a harsher character. The mountains, so dramatic in daylight, would soon be wreathed in fog and rain. The very geography that the German High Command had studied so carefully would begin to exert its influence not just on maps and strategic plans, but on the bodies and morale of the soldiers who had to traverse it. Manstein's reputation suggested he would not make reckless errors born of impatience. He was the sort of commander who might spend weeks in careful preparation, studying every contour of the land, ensuring his artillery was positioned correctly, his supply lines secure, before committing to a major assault. And yet, the strategic clock was ticking. Winter was coming. The longer the 11th Army remained in Crimea, the more stretched the German resources became elsewhere. There was a race against time, against geography, against the defending enemy, and Manstein understood all three of these pressures simultaneously. That is what made him a dangerous opponent. Not recklessness, but clarity about what the terrain demanded and the will to impose discipline on his forces, even when faster solutions seemed tempting. The mountains and steppe of Crimea would shape everything that followed in the coming months of siege and assault. The autumn rains had turned the Crimean steppe into something between mud and sea, and it was into this difficult ground that Manstein's 11th Army advanced in late September of 1941. The German columns moved south toward what would become the gateway to Sevastopol itself, a place with a name that would echo through the coming months with the weight of repeated assault and resistance. The Isthmus of Perekop, barely more than a narrow strip of land no wider in places than 7 kilometers, connecting the vast steppe to the Crimean Peninsula proper, was the natural choke point. It was always meant to be a defensive position, and the Soviets had been fortifying it since the first whispers of German expansion toward the south. Picture, if you will, the desolate vastness of that approach. The land rises gradually, dunes and earthworks, anti-tank ditches dug with the knowledge that an enemy would come, that this narrow gateway could hold or could be breached. The Soviet defenders there, units of the Red Army pulled together from the steppe and reinforced with whatever troops could be spared, understood the geometry of their position. They had the advantage of higher ground, prepared positions, barbed wire strung in patterns meant to funnel attackers into fields of fire. But they were also stretched thin. How many men could adequately defend a line when the enemy approaching you numbered in the tens of thousands? The German assault on Perekop began on the 24th of September, and it was not the lightning thrust that panzer formations had become famous for. Instead, it was methodical, grinding infantry work, the kind of fighting that required patience and the willingness to absorb casualties. The Soviets fought with skill and determination, their artillery responding to German movements, their machine guns placed with care in the fortified positions they held. But slowly, gradually, through a series of local attacks and probing movements that exploited weaknesses in the Soviet line, the Germans began to push forward. By early October, after more than a week of sustained fighting, the Soviet defenders began to recognize that their position, however strong it had seemed, could not be held indefinitely against the growing pressure. There is something quietly tragic in the decision to withdraw. It is not a rout or a panic, but rather the slow, deliberate acknowledgement that to hold at the isthmus was to risk being surrounded and cut off, to allow the Germans to bypass the position entirely through flanking movements across the steppe. The Soviet commander made the difficult choice to fall back, to preserve his forces, to trade space for time, though he would not have known then just how much time that space would buy him, or at what cost. The retreat itself, as October deepened, became a race towards Sevastopol. Soviet units moved back across roads churned to mud by the autumn weather, their trucks struggling, their horse-drawn artillery parks moving with the slow inevitability of animals in bad conditions. Behind them came the Germans, not in the fast-moving columns that had characterized the summer campaigns in Russia, but in the steady, purposeful advance of infantry following armor, securing captured ground, consolidating positions. The steppe itself seemed indifferent to this movement, vast and empty, with only the distant Crimean mountains visible as the defenders fell back toward their intended stronghold. What is curious to contemplate is how the geography itself shaped the psychology of this retreat. The land was open, offering little shelter, little sense of a front line that could be held. The defenders were moving backward through territory they knew would become the occupied zone, toward a city that represented the last possible place to make a stand. By mid-October, the outer perimeter of Sevastopol's defenses came into view for those who were retreating, a ring of fortified positions, hills, ravines, and prepared gun emplacements that had been constructed over years. To those exhausted Soviet soldiers, it must have seemed like sanctuary, or at the very least, a more defensible position than the open steppe behind them. The Germans, meanwhile, were beginning to understand the scale of what lay before them. Intelligence reports spoke of fortress fortifications, of prepared positions, of a naval base transformed into a stronghold. Manstein himself, studying maps and reports from his command post, could see that the rapid encirclement of Soviet forces on the peninsula was succeeding, but that the city itself would require something far more substantial than the mobile warfare that had worked so well on the open steppe. The Germans were learning what attackers had learned centuries before, that a fortress city, even one beleaguered and undersupplied, presents a fundamentally different problem than an army in the field. By late October, the encirclement was nearly complete. German forces had pushed across the peninsula, cutting off any retreat northward for Soviet troops trapped in Crimea. The defenders were being compressed into an ever smaller area, and Sevastopol itself, with its ring of hills and fortifications, was becoming less a choice of position and more a geometric necessity, the only ground left to stand on. The city's population, swollen with refugees from the fighting to the north, was beginning to sense what was coming. The initial German drive had succeeded in its purpose. The campaign had entered its second, far more destructive phase, and no one in those October days could have imagined that nearly 9 months would pass before Sevastopol finally fell. The siege had not yet begun in earnest, but the preliminary movements, the vast chess game of maneuver and withdrawal, had brought both armies to the threshold of one of the longest, most brutal sieges of the entire war. The geography of Sevastopol itself, though, tells much of the story of why this city would prove so extraordinarily difficult to take. Imagine, if you will, standing on the outskirts of the city as autumn deepens, the light growing long and amber across the water. What you would notice, what any general's eye would immediately register, is that Sevastopol does not sit flatly upon the coast like so many ports do. Rather, it nestles into a series of natural amphitheatres. The harbour, that precious deep-water anchorage that had drawn the Russian fleet southward for more than a century, is itself ringed by a succession of hills and ridges that rise in irregular waves away from the shore. These are not mountains precisely. They are something more subtle and, in their way, more formidable. The limestone heights form what military men call a naturally fortified perimeter, though they were shaped by weather and time long before any fortress engineer ever drew a plan. The Soviet commanders who found themselves tasked with holding Sevastopol in late 1941 inherited, then, not merely a city, but a landscape that seemed almost to have been designed by some absent strategist of centuries past. The ridgelines that encircle the outer approaches, the high ground that sweeps around the northern and eastern faces of the defensive zone, provided what might be called natural ramparts. These were not vertical cliffs, you understand, but they possessed sufficient elevation and steepness that an attacking force would be forever climbing, forever exposed, forever unable to establish any real momentum once the defenders decided to contest them. A soldier scrambling upward through stone and scrub has little chance against fire coming from above. This simple principle of warfare, as old as the throwing of stones itself, gave Sevastopol an inherent advantage that would prove impossible for any attacker to fully overcome. The landscape is scored too by deep ravines, some of them quite dramatic, cutting through the terrain like the strokes of a knife through cloth. These gullies and gorges run in many directions through the surrounding hills, creating a sort of natural maze. For an attacking army trying to advance, these ravines became obstacles both physical and psychological. A unit moving forward across open ground could find itself suddenly at the lip of a deep cut, forcing a deviation, forcing a halt, forcing a decision that cost precious time and momentum. For defenders positioned with knowledge of the terrain, knowledge that came from being born there, or from having studied the maps and walked the ground for weeks before the siege began, these same ravines became avenues of approach, hidden routes for moving reserves, places where counter-attacking forces might suddenly appear from what had seemed like empty ground. The actual fortifications that the Russians had begun constructing in the months before the German arrival worked in concert with this natural geography rather than against it. It would be a misconception to imagine that Sevastopol was enclosed in a simple ring of trenches and walls. Rather, the defences were layered. Outer positions took advantage of the distant ridgelines. Inner positions utilised the terrain closer to the city itself. Multiple forts, some inherited from the Crimean War of 1854, that earlier siege that had burned itself into Russian historical memory, were scattered throughout the defensive zone. Fort Maxim Gorky, the largest and most formidable, dominated the northern approaches from a high position that offered clear fields of fire across the surrounding steppe and approaching hills. Other, smaller forts and fortified positions occupied key elevations throughout the surrounding terrain, creating what military planners called a defense in depth. An attacker breaking through one line would face another. Artillery and machine gun fire could be concentrated from multiple angles, from positions that were physically separated from one another by terrain features that made coordination of attack extraordinarily difficult. There is something almost meditative about the way this landscape works, if one thinks about it from the perspective of pure geography divorced for a moment from human suffering. The hills and ravines and ridgelines create what we might call a natural friction. Movement through such terrain demands resources, time, men, energy, careful calculation. An army trying to advance through relatively open country, across plains or gentle slopes, can sometimes build up momentum, can sometimes overwhelm defenses through sheer weight of numbers and velocity. But terrain like Sevastopol's resists such momentum inherently. It imposes a rhythm upon military operations. Everything must be slower. Everything must be more methodical. The landscape itself becomes an ally to whoever defends it. As autumn turned toward winter in 1941, the German commanders who began their approach toward this fortified zone would have been acutely aware of these geographic realities. Erich von Manstein, for all his tactical brilliance, would have recognized that the terrain ahead did not favor rapid maneuver or decisive breakthrough. The Crimean Peninsula itself, you see, narrows considerably as one moves eastward towards Sevastopol. The Sea of Azov lies to the north, the Black Sea to the south. The space between them squeezes progressively tighter. An army cannot maneuver easily when it is confined between two seas. The flanks are fixed. One cannot send cavalry wide to the north or south. Everything becomes a matter of forward pressure along a relatively narrow front. And that narrow front leads eventually into a maze of hills and ravines where the advantage shifts entirely to whoever knows the ground and has had time to prepare defenses upon it. The limestone that comprises the hills around Sevastopol is relatively soft compared to granite or other harder stone, which meant that both defenders and attackers could excavate it with somewhat greater ease. Tunnel networks could be dug, underground shelters could be carved, observation posts could be positioned within the stone itself. The Russians, understanding this advantage, would in the months ahead excavate extensive underground positions within these limestone ridges, galleries and dugouts, and firing positions that would give their defenders protection from artillery fire and allow them to concentrate their forces in ways that German attackers, approaching across open ground, could never quite predict or prevent. A soldier in an underground bunker is nearly invulnerable to the worst that an attacking artillery barrage can deliver. A soldier crossing open ground is exposed to everything. And so, as we move forward into what must come next in this story, the encirclement of Sevastopol that was already beginning to take shape, it becomes essential to understand that the Germans were not merely approaching a city or a harbour. They were approaching a landscape that had, through nothing more than the accident of geology, been arranged in such a way as to favour defensive warfare. Hills and ravines and ridgelines and deep water created a natural fortress that no amount of German tactical cleverness or willpower could entirely overcome. The question that the coming weeks and months would answer, though, was whether a determined and well-equipped attacking force, with sufficient time and sufficient artillery and sufficient manpower, might not still find ways to break through even such naturally favourable terrain. That question would be answered across the winter and spring that lay ahead, but the terrain itself would never stop being part of the answer. By the first weeks of October, the German columns had begun to close their grip around Sevastopol like a slow, inevitable hand. The Soviet defenders, who had retreated southward from the Isthmus of Perekop, fighting a desperate fighting withdrawal across the steppe, now found themselves pressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. The city itself lay at the southern tip of the Crimean Peninsula, and there was nowhere left to retreat. Behind Sevastopol lay only the sea. Ahead lay an enemy growing stronger with each passing day as von Manstein's 11th Army consolidated its hold on the surrounding heights and ridgelines. The encirclement, which would eventually become the longest and one of the most grinding sieges of the entire war on the European continent, had begun in earnest. What was it, do you suppose, that occurred in the minds of Sevastopol's defenders during those autumn weeks? Many of them knew the city's history from their schoolbooks. They had heard the stories of the Great Siege of 1854, when Russian and British and French forces had clashed here in the Crimean War nearly a century before. That siege had lasted nearly a year. The older soldiers among the defenders, the ones who had perhaps served in the Red Navy or the Tsarist forces before the Revolution, must have carried those narratives with them like a weight they could not quite set down. The fortifications themselves still bore the scars of that older conflict, the reinforced bastions and casemates that had been built or rebuilt across the decades. Now, in 1941, as the encirclement tightened, history seemed to be returning with a kind of terrible symmetry. The Soviet command structure in Sevastopol was not unified in those early days. Admiral Philip Oktyabrski commanded the naval forces from his headquarters, the guns and ships of the Black Sea Fleet now converted to a land defense role, their crews pressed into service as artillery and infantry. General Ivan Petrov, commanding the land forces, coordinated with Oktyabrski as best he could, but the friction that arises between different military branches, the competition for resources and authority, created an inefficiency that would haunt the defense for months to come. Nevertheless, both men understood with absolute clarity what was unfolding. The Germans were not going to simply bypass Sevastopol and move on. The city was too important, too symbolic, too filled with Soviet naval assets and defensive strength. Von Manstein wanted it. Hitler wanted it, and so it would be besieged. By early November, the German encirclement was complete. Soviet forces held the fortress city and the rocky, fortified peninsula it occupied, but the narrow land approaches were sealed. The ring of German infantry, artillery, and fortified positions stretched in a rough arc from north to south, and German airfields now operated from within Crimea itself. Supplies could come only by sea, and the sea lanes were increasingly contested by German aircraft and naval forces. Every ship that ran supplies through the gauntlet of German air attacks and mines took damage. Some never made it at all. The Soviet High Command in Moscow began to understand, slowly and with growing alarm, that Sevastopol had become isolated. It would have to endure. Within the city and the outlying fortified positions, civilians and soldiers alike were settling in for what many feared would be a long ordeal. The evacuation of non-essential personnel had already begun in September, before the encirclement was complete. Mothers clutching children, elderly people, Workers from the factories and administrative offices, they had been loaded onto ships and sent northward, away from Crimea, but many had remained. Some could not be evacuated, others refused to leave their homes, their work, their communities. They would stay behind the lines, in the shelters and cellars and underground passages that honeycombed the city and its forts, waiting out a siege they could not have fully imagined. The physical preparations for a long siege were already underway. Food stores were being inventoried and rationed. Water sources were being secured. Hospitals were being relocated underground or into heavily fortified buildings. The Soviet engineers, who had been working on the fortifications for weeks, now redoubled their efforts, strengthening walls, digging trenches, improving field of fire and sightlines from the main forts. At Maxim Gorky, the mighty fortress that rose from the rocky heights to the east of Sevastopol's main harbour, the gun crews made final adjustments to their enormous weapons. At the other coastal defence positions, Fort Stalin, Fort Molotov, Fort Soviets, the work continued through the shortening days of autumn. The weather was turning, temperatures were dropping, rain and wind came more frequently. The Mediterranean fall was giving way to something colder, harsher, less forgiving. And what of the German forces surrounding the city? They were also preparing, but with a different expectation. Many of them had believed, as von Manstein himself had believed, that Sevastopol would fall relatively quickly. The Isthmus of Perekop had been crossed. Crimea had been conquered except for this last fortress. Surely, the logic suggested, a direct assault would succeed. Surely the fortress would surrender within weeks. The Kriegsmarine had lost ships to torpedo and mine. The Luftwaffe had exhausted itself in the fighting across southern Russia. But von Manstein had troops, and he had artillery, and he had the confidence born of a campaign that had carried him from the Atlantic seaboard to the gates of Moscow. Sevastopol, he believed, could be crushed. It would simply require the application of sufficient force. But as October turned to November, and the first assaults began to probe the Soviet defences, something unforeseen began to emerge. The fortress would not yield quickly. The defenders, far from being demoralized by the encirclement, seemed to settle into a kind of grim determination. The geography of Sevastopol itself, those ridges and ravines and forts we spoke of earlier, created a defensive strength that was not easily broken by frontal assault. And the Soviet sailors, converted overnight into infantry and artillery crews, fought with a kind of fierce dedication that surprised many of the German soldiers who faced them. They were far from their ships, far from the war they had trained for, but they were defending their home fleet's base, and many of them would not surrender it without shedding their blood upon every metre of its rocky slopes. So there it was, as autumn deepened into early winter, the geometry of the siege settling into place. A city surrounded, supply lines reduced to a trickle over mined and contested waters, a civilian and military population of perhaps 50,000 souls, though estimates varied depending on how many stragglers and refugees you counted, now committed to holding out against an enemy that greatly outnumbered them. The German forces investing the fortress numbered perhaps 75,000 men or more, growing as reinforcements arrived. The Soviet garrison, counting sailors, soldiers, and militia, was perhaps half that, yet the fortress remained intact. The German assaults of early November had failed, bloodily, against walls that would not break and defenders who would not flee. Both sides, as November advanced, were settling in for a test of wills and endurance. The Germans would need to bring in heavier artillery, to concentrate their assault, to find a way through the fortified positions that seemed to multiply upon examination. The Soviets would need to hold out long enough for the high command in Moscow to figure out how to relieve them. It was a race, though neither side fully articulated it as such. A race against starvation, against attrition, against the grinding wear of a siege that, even now in its earliest weeks, was beginning to assume the proportions of a historical event. Both sides, in their own way, were preparing for something that would last far longer than anyone had expected when the autumn leaves began to fall across the Crimean Peninsula. The city that had once thrummed with the ordinary rhythms of peacetime, the clatter of trams along Lenin Street, the calls of vendors near the central market, the murmur of sailors on shore leave, had transformed into something else entirely. Not suddenly, but in the way a harbour gradually stills when the barometer drops. By late October, as German artillery positions ringed the heights above Sevastopol, the people living within those limestone walls had begun to inhabit a different sort of existence. It was not yet the desperate calculus of survival that would come later, but rather a careful, measured descent into the rhythms of siege life. The shelters had existed in various states of readiness for months. Some were natural caves carved into the soft chalk cliffs that honeycomb the city's interior, widened now with pickaxes and filled with the simple furniture of endurance: wooden benches, oil lamps that cast shadows in wavering pools, the omnipresent damp cold that never quite lifted from stone, that had known only the sea's warmth for centuries. Other shelters were man-made, reinforced basements of the former Imperial Hotel and other public buildings, or hastily excavated trenches roofed with railway ties and covered with earth, packed tight enough to stop shrapnel, but low enough that a tall man had to stoop to enter. Families moved through these spaces with the quiet acceptance of people adapting to new constraints. Children learned to recognize the difference between the whistle of incoming fire and the distant rumble of ships' guns offshore. The sound became as familiar as birdsong had once been. In the submarine base and naval installations scattered through the harbor, a different kind of waiting unfolded. Soviet sailors who had trained to operate in open waters now found themselves manning gun positions on hillsides they had never expected to defend. The Black Sea Fleet, once the pride of Soviet naval power, had largely evacuated to Batumi and other ports before the encirclement tightened completely, but certain ships remained, torpedo boats, minesweepers, and a handful of destroyers that would make desperate runs through minefields and dive bomber attacks to deliver ammunition and evacuate the wounded. The gunners who crewed the coastal defense batteries knew their role was to hold the Germans at a distance, to buy time, though for what exactly remained unclear. Time, it seemed, was all there was to trade in now. Time and ammunition, and the hope that something might change before both ran out simultaneously. The schoolchildren had begun their evacuation even before the encirclement was complete. Mothers stood in queues at the docks, holding small hands, watching as their children were herded onto overcrowded transports that would attempt to slip past the German air superiority toward the safety of ports to the south or east. It was one of the cruelest aspects of siege, the separation of families, the choice between sending a child to uncertain safety or keeping them in a place that was rapidly becoming more dangerous. The schools themselves, where lessons had continued with almost stubborn normalcy through September, were gradually emptied of their younger students. The buildings would soon serve other purposes, as hospitals, ammunition stores, command posts, shelters for those too old or too infirm to be evacuated. A blackboard might still hold the chalk marks of a geography lesson, the map of the Soviet Union half erased, when soldiers arrived to stack crates of supplies in the corners. The rhythm of rationed days established itself with surprising speed, the way humans adapt to privation when it arrives gradually enough. Bread became precious, its allocation shrinking each week as the siege tightened and supply ships found it harder to break through. A family of 4 might receive enough black bread for perhaps 3 days, if they were fortunate, supplemented with salted fish from warehouse stocks and whatever vegetables had been preserved in the autumn before the Germans arrived. Civilians and soldiers ate from the same strained supplies, though soldiers received slightly larger portions, a recognition that they would need strength for the labor of defending the city. Cooking became a matter of careful arithmetic. A woman with a small stove in an apartment still standing might be allocated her portion of wood or coal, enough perhaps to cook a pot of thin soup, to boil water for tea, which remained a luxury but not yet an impossibility. The smell of that cooking, thin as it was, still carried the memory of normal life. The civilian population that had not been evacuated numbered roughly 30,000 souls, though the exact figure remains uncertain, as records in a besieged city are not always scrupulously maintained. They occupied a strange liminal space, not soldiers, not at war, yet entirely contained within a military catastrophe. Some were the elderly, too infirm to be transported. Some were workers deemed essential, doctors and nurses, though their ability to treat the wounded was rapidly diminishing as supplies dwindled. Engineers and workers in the docks, though their labor now served the military rather than commerce. Administrators who kept the city's basic functions limping forward. And some were simply those who had been left behind in the chaos, or who had chosen to remain, or who had missed evacuation transports and found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the perimeter. They moved through a city that was gradually being remade by the war. The elegant Tsarist-era buildings on the main streets began to show damage. Shells had torn holes in facades, exposing the interiors of rooms to the sky. Rubble accumulated in corners. Windows were covered with paper or wood or cloth, eliminating light, but also offering some protection from blast and fragmentation. The naval garrison, numbering perhaps 10,000 men, also adapted to the strange half-existence of a besieged port. Ships that could no longer operate in open water were converted into floating gun batteries or storage vessels. Others were scuttled deliberately in the harbour, their hulls positioned to create additional obstacles should the Germans attempt a waterborne assault, something they were not trained or equipped to do, though the naval command did not dismiss the possibility. The sailors maintained their watches, cleaned their guns, studied maps and observation posts, waited. Some were billeted in naval barracks within the city. Others occupied fortified positions in caves and dugouts. They were sailors without a sea to sail, gunners without a clear field of fire, mechanics without ships to maintain. They had become soldiers, but not soldiers in the traditional sense. They belonged to a realm that was neither fully military nor civilian, suspended in a place where the sea was visible beyond the perimeter they could not cross. In the hospitals, and there were several, from the large naval hospital to makeshift clinics established in basements and caves, a different kind of rhythm prevailed. The first weeks of the siege saw relatively few casualties, as the Germans consolidated their positions and planned their assaults. But the wounded from the fighting at Perekop and from the daily artillery exchanges that occurred as soon as the encirclement tightened, began to arrive in increasing numbers. Medical supplies were precious, carefully rationed by doctors who had to make decisions about who received antibiotics and who did not, who might recover with rest, and who needed surgery that might consume resources needed for 3 or 4 others. The doctors who remained, and some had been evacuated before the siege closed in, worked with the grim focus of people doing impossible mathematics. How does one decide which life is expendable? The question hung unspoken over every ward, every operating table. There was a strange beauty in the adaptation, a kind of melancholy nobility in the way people carved out small moments of normalcy within the siege. A group of men might gather in a shelter and sing songs in quiet voices, the sound barely louder than conversation, almost as if they were ashamed of their own nostalgia. An old woman might tend a small garden in a courtyard, coaxing what little growth she could manage, from soil depleted by constant shaking from artillery fire. A sailor might write letters that would never be posted, simply because the act of writing seemed to connect him to a world beyond the perimeter. These small acts were not resistance exactly, nor were they capitulation. They were simply the human refusal to be entirely consumed by circumstances, the quiet assertion that life, even under siege, contained moments of meaning beyond mere survival. The nights were perhaps the hardest. Darkness fell completely once blackout was enforced. No lights visible from the city, lest they guide the bombers and artillery spotters. The city became a place of complete darkness, except for the occasional flare dropped by German planes, which would illuminate the landscape in harsh white light for a moment, before falling away again, leaving the darkness deeper than before. People moved by memory and touch, feeling their way through streets they had walked 1,000 times before, but which seemed transformed by the absence of light. The sound of the sea remained constant, the waves touching the shore with the same rhythm they had always known, indifferent to human conflict, a reminder that the world extended beyond the siege, though from within Sevastopol it sometimes seemed that the siege was everything. the whole of human experience compressed into a few square kilometers of limestone cliffs and desperate endurance. The autumn rains had turned the approaches to Sevastopol into a landscape of mud and shallow ravines, each slope a potential killing ground. By late October, as the German 11th Army consolidated its positions around the city, Erich von Manstein began to perceive the shape of what lay ahead. He was not a man given to hasty assaults. His reputation, built carefully through campaigns in Poland and France, rested on precision, on understanding terrain, on the calculation of cost against gain. Yet all around him, the pressure mounted. Berlin wanted results. The Black Sea Fleet was still operational within the harbour. Soviet reinforcements, it seemed, might arrive at any moment. By the first weeks of November, Manstein had positioned his forces in a rough semicircle around Sevastopol's northern and eastern approaches, with the sea itself forming an impassable wall to the south and west. The city was not yet fully encircled, supply ships still occasionally slipped through at night, but the noose was tightening, one knot at a time. The decision to attack came not from impatience, though impatience was certainly present, but from a more pragmatic calculation. The Soviet defenders had spent the autumn weeks strengthening their fortifications, digging deeper into the limestone hills, linking trenches with underground passages, and establishing overlapping fields of fire from a network of reinforced strongpoints. The longer the German army waited, the stronger that network would become. And so, in the first days of November, Manstein ordered the assault to begin. It would not be a single, overwhelming blow, but rather a series of probing attacks, designed to find the weak points in the Soviet defenses, to test the resilience of the defenders, and to create conditions for a larger breakthrough to follow. The weather on the morning the assault commenced was grey and threatening, the kind of northern chill that seemed to sap warmth from flesh and certainty from the mind. German infantry units, drawn from the 11th Army's various corps, advanced toward the outer Soviet defensive lines with rifles held ready, artillery support rumbling behind them. What awaited them, though, was something they had perhaps underestimated. The Soviet defenders, under the command of Ivan Petrov and his staff officers ensconced in underground bunkers, had prepared for this moment with a deliberateness born of desperation. Every approach had been registered for artillery fire. Every likely assembly area for German troops had been pre-targeted with defensive concentrations. The fortifications themselves, the trench systems, the anti-tank ditches, the positions for machine guns and mortars, formed a layered defense that could not be easily bypassed or broken with a single assault. The Germans advanced. The Soviet defenders waited until the attackers were at optimal range, and then the killing began. Machine gun fire raked across the advancing infantry. Artillery shells, called down by forward observers watching from fortified positions, began to tear apart the carefully ordered formations. The attackers pressed forward, driven by training and by the momentum of their initial assault, but they were moving uphill into prepared positions against an enemy that had chosen the ground and prepared it with meticulous care. By midday, the first German units had suffered grievous casualties and gained only a few hundred meters of ground. By evening, as darkness and exhaustion finally brought the assault to a halt, the sum total of the German advance was measured not in victories or breakthroughs, but in losses that far exceeded whatever tactical gain had been achieved. What made this assault historically significant, though, was not the fact that it failed. Sieges are filled with failed assaults, but rather the way that failure was absorbed and processed by the German command. Manstein, observing from his headquarters the reports filtering in from the front, reached a conclusion that many commanders in his position might have resisted. The direct approach, the attempt to bull through the Soviet defensive lines by sheer force and determination, was not going to work. To continue down that path would be to feed more and more soldiers into a grinding, brutal battle of attrition, a form of warfare in which the Germans, with their smaller population and finite reserves of manpower, could never hope to prevail. The Soviet Union, with its vast reserves of men, could absorb such losses far more readily than Germany could. And so, Rather than renewing the assault the following day, Manstein made the decision to halt, to regroup, and to fundamentally rethink his approach. This was not, it should be understood, a decision born of weakness or lack of will. It was, rather, the fruit of a more sophisticated military intelligence. Manstein recognized something that many military commanders in positions of power have failed to grasp throughout history, that the mere possession of superior firepower, of larger forces arrayed against the enemy, does not guarantee victory if those forces are deployed without proper consideration of the tactical and strategic environment in which they will operate. The Soviet defenders had taken the high ground, quite literally, and had fortified it. They held interior lines, which meant they could shift their reserves more quickly than the Germans could, whose own reinforcements had to traverse much greater distances and navigate the chaos of their own logistical lines. To break through would require not merely courage and determination, of which both sides had ample supply, but an entirely different approach to the problem. Over the following weeks, as November turned slowly toward December, Manstein's staff began the laborious work of preparing what would come to be known as the second major assault on Sevastopol. It would be larger, better coordinated, and far more carefully prepared than the initial November attack had been. Artillery would be brought forward, in even greater quantities. Infantry would be concentrated at points where the Soviet defenses appeared least strong. New assault tactics, incorporating lessons learned from the failed attacks, would be developed and drilled into the attacking units. The siege, Manstein had come to understand, was not going to be won in days or even weeks. It would require patience, accumulation of resources, and a willingness to absorb the losses that such an undertaking would inevitably entail. The city of Sevastopol, it seemed, would extract its own price in blood and iron from any army that sought to take it, whether that army was German or Soviet, whether it came from the north or from the east. And so the siege entered a new phase, less dramatic than the initial assault, but no less consequential for the soldiers and civilians who found themselves enmeshed within it. The first assault had failed, but it had also provided valuable intelligence about the strength and depth of the Soviet defenses. It had cost both sides dearly, but it had established something, that this would be no quick victory, no swift capitulation of a city that had already demonstrated, in the short time it had been under assault, a capacity for resistance that many had perhaps doubted it would possess. As the November assault faded into costly memory, and both sides settled into the grim calculus of siege warfare, it became clear that the real architects of Sevastopol's defense were not the soldiers hurrying between trenches, but the engineers and gunners who had, years before any cannon fired, embedded themselves into the very geology of the peninsula. The fortress city did not simply happen to be defensible. It had been painstakingly, almost obsessively made so, and at the heart of that fortification network stood a series of coastal forts that represented perhaps the most ambitious exercise in Soviet military engineering of the pre-war decade. The most famous of these, and the one that would bear the heaviest burden of the coming bombardment, was Fort Maxim Gorky. Named after the Russian writer and revolutionary sympathizer, this installation sat on the northern heights overlooking the harbor, a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and underground galleries that seemed, from above, less like a traditional fort and more like a small underground city carved into the rock itself. To understand Maxim Gorky was to understand something essential about how the Soviets imagined coastal defense in an era when aircraft were becoming the dominant weapon, when naval power still mattered deeply, and when the lessons of the First World War had not yet fully faded from military memory. The fort's primary armament consisted of a pair of massive 305mm guns, weapons that fired shells weighing nearly half a ton, that had originally been mounted on battleships in the twilight years of the Russian Empire. These were not the largest guns that could be found in Sevastopol, but they were among the most formidable, capable of striking targets miles distant with devastating accuracy. Mounted in a rotating turret sunk deep into a reinforced concrete structure, these twin cannons could be retracted into protective casings when under air attack, emerging only to deliver their thunderous salvos. The engineering required to move such massive weapons, to train and elevate them with precision, to supply them with ammunition, and keep them functioning in the salt air and the damp darkness of the bunkers below. This was a triumph of Soviet military-industrial organization. But Maxim Gorky was far more than a pair of large guns sitting in a turret. Surrounding the main battery was a labyrinth of supporting positions. Medium-caliber guns provided defensive fire. Anti-aircraft artillery occupied separate concrete emplacements, anticipating the day when German planes would come to silence these guns or seek revenge for the shells that rained down from them. The fort contained sleeping quarters, ammunition magazines buried so deeply underground that no ordinary bomb could reach them, command posts with telephone lines running to every corner of the defensive perimeter, and ventilation systems designed to keep the air breathable during the most intense bombardments. The engineers had even incorporated water storage tanks and medical facilities, the assumption being that once the siege began, the garrison might be sealed inside for months. Consider for a moment the sheer logistics of such construction. The Soviets had broken the bedrock itself, removing thousands of tons of stone and earth. They had poured millions of tons of concrete that had to be mixed, transported, placed with meticulous care to ensure structural integrity. Steel reinforcement bars had been bent and woven through the concrete at precise intervals, their exact positioning critical to the fort's ability to withstand the impact of heavy ordnance. The Fort Maxim Gorky had been substantially completed by the early 1930s, though refinements and additions had continued right up until the war began. By 1941, it represented a physical investment of resources, material, labor, and engineering expertise that reflected how seriously the Soviet military took the defense of their principal naval base on the Black Sea. Yet Maxim Gorky was not alone. Around the harbor, the Soviets had constructed an entire constellation of similar installations. To the south, across the entrance to the harbor itself, stood Fort Konstantinovsky, another massive fortification, equipped with its own artillery batteries. Further west, in the Balaklava sector, lay Fort Balaklava, guarding the western approaches to the fortress city. Each of these forts was designed to be mutually supporting, their fields of fire overlapping, so that an attacking force could not approach one without exposing itself to the fire of its neighbors. The Soviets had learned the lessons of the Crimean War of 1854, when Sevastopol had stood against British, French, and Ottoman siege forces. They had studied those old engagements, examined the defensive lines that had held for months, and then imagined how to build something even stronger, with weapons far more powerful than anything that existed in the 1850s. The gun crews themselves, and here we enter the realm of those who would actually operate these mechanical marvels, were drawn from the Soviet Navy. These were men trained over years to work as disciplined teams, each member knowing his role with the kind of precision that only endless drilling could produce. The gun captain, responsible for aiming the weapon, the loaders, working in choreographed rhythm to feed massive shells into the breech, the ammunition handlers below, in the magazines, selecting the right projectiles and passing them up through the chain, the spotters, trained to observe where shells landed and to relay corrections to the gun crew, the telephone operators, maintaining the delicate threads of communication that held the fort together. When such a gun fired, and the 305mm guns of Maxim Gorky would fire thousands of times during the coming siege, the effect was not merely the discharge of explosive force. It was, in a sense, the release of all the engineering, all the labor, all the accumulated expertise that had gone into creating both the weapon and the fortification that housed it. The recoil alone was tremendous, controlled by hydraulic buffers that had themselves been engineering marvels. The noise was deafening, even to those who had heard it countless times. The concussion rippled outward, rattling every window for miles around, reminding everyone, German soldiers in the lines, Soviet civilians huddled in cellars, the crews of ships in the harbor, that Sevastopol was not going to be taken without cost. As the winter of 1941 approached, and the siege began to settle into its grinding routine, These forts became something more than mere military installations. They became symbols of Soviet determination to hold. They became, in the minds of the defenders, talismans of hope. The massive guns spoke a language that crossed all barriers of language and culture, the language of firepower, of technological prowess, of the will to resist. The Germans, gathering on the hills above the city, looking down at the concrete fortifications and knowing what guns lay within them, understood that any assault on Sevastopol would have to account for these installations. They could not simply be ignored, and they could not easily be overcome by conventional assault. The question that occupied the minds of German military planners was a straightforward one, yet its answer would require months of preparation and thousands of tons of additional artillery. How does one silence a fort that is designed to withstand precisely the kinds of attacks that armies could conventionally bring to bear against it? The answer, as it would emerge in the spring of 1942, would involve bringing to bear weapons so enormous that they existed at the very frontier of what was technically feasible to construct and move by rail. But in the quiet of the winter siege, as snow began to fall on the defensive lines, the forts still stood intact, their guns still ready, their crews still vigilant. They were relics, perhaps, of an older age of warfare, forts in the age of aircraft and armor. Yet they endured, and they would endure for months more. As November's grey faded into December, the Crimean winter began its slow descent upon the siege lines that now ringed Sevastopol like a tightening fist. The temperature dropped steadily through the first weeks of the month, and with it came a peculiar transformation of the battlefield itself. The dry steppe that had surrounded the city in autumn began to freeze, the soil hardening into ridged earth that made digging trenches exponentially more difficult. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow that fell in thick, suffocating blankets, covering the barbed wire entanglements and the shell craters and the frozen bodies left from the November assaults. All of it white, all of it silent, all of it erasing the evidence of violence beneath a deceptive blanket of peace. The German 11th Army, having failed to break through the fortified lines in their November offensive, settled into what would become a long winter ordeal of their own. Manstein's men were not equipped for a prolonged Crimean winter. The southern peninsula, while warmer than the Russian steppes to the north, was still a place of bitter cold, howling winds that cut across the exposed positions, and the ever-present damp that seeped through even thick winter coats. The supply lines stretching back across the peninsula grew increasingly difficult to maintain. Food was rationed, fuel for heating was scarce. Many of the troops had believed, even through early December, that they would be celebrating Christmas in Moscow. Now they faced the likelihood of spending it in trenches on the outskirts of a fortress city that refused to surrender. And yet the winter brought something that neither the Germans nor the defenders had fully anticipated: a strange, almost meditative lull in the ferocity of combat. The major offensives paused. The artillery bombardment that had been nearly constant throughout November eased into something more intermittent, more selective. The frozen ground made rapid advances nearly impossible for either side. Trench warfare, that grinding, attritional form of battle that had defined the First World War and now seemed to be returning, settled over the lines like frost itself. Each side hunkered down into their positions, conserving resources, conserving men. The world inside Sevastopol during these winter months was one of profound, muffled quiet, punctuated by sudden violence. Underground, in the deep shelters and command bunkers that had been carved into the bedrock beneath the city, the sound of wind and cold felt almost distant. The clatter of supply lorries moving through the frozen streets gave way, increasingly, to the shuffle of boots on icy ground, the murmur of voices speaking in hushed tones, as if raising one's voice might draw enemy attention. The Soviet defenders, led by Admiral Ivan Isakov, who had arrived in late November to take command of the naval garrison, began to understand the rhythms of a siege that might not be measured in weeks, but in months. The city had enough food for rationing. The underground factories and repair facilities continued to produce what they could. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet, despite the blockade, continued to send supplies by small boats during darkness, threading their way through the German naval cordon. Patrols became the punctuation marks of this winter quiet. Night after night, small groups of soldiers from both sides would venture into the frozen no-man's land between the trenches. These were reconnaissance missions, supply runs, searches for wood or other materials that could be burned for heat. They were also opportunities for sudden, violent encounters. A patrol might stumble upon an enemy position, a sentry might open fire, a grenade might flash silently through the darkness, its sound muffled by the thick snow. These encounters were brief, brutal, and then silence would return. The men involved would shuffle back to their own lines, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air, and the cold would settle back over the battlefield like a heavy blanket. The snipers, too, became creatures of the winter. Both the German and Soviet armies maintained highly trained marksmen who operated in the frozen landscape. They would spend entire days, sometimes, motionless in a sniper's nest, waiting for the moment when an enemy soldier would become careless, would expose himself for just a moment. The crack of a rifle shot would echo across the frozen ground, and a man would fall. Then the marksman would settle back into silence, into waiting. These duels within the larger siege were intimate in a way that artillery bombardment could never be. A sniper knew, often, the identity of the enemy he was hunting. He had learned the patterns of his opponent's movements, the times of day when he took his rations outside to eat, the route he walked along the trench line. It was a form of warfare that required patience, which the winter somehow encouraged. And the distance artillery remained, throughout these months, a constant and distant presence. Not the furious, concentrated bombardment that had characterized the opening weeks of the siege, but rather sporadic volleys that seemed almost contemplative in their timing. A battery might fire a few shells toward the city in the morning, targeting either the harbor or the known positions of the Soviet guns. There would be silence for hours. Then, from the German lines, or from a Soviet gun position hidden in the hills, more shells would arrive. The concussions would ripple through the frozen ground. Windows would rattle in their frames, or shatter entirely. Buildings damaged in earlier bombardments would shed more stone and brick. But there was a rhythm to it now, a kind of dialogue conducted across the frozen landscape in the language of explosions and concussions. The Soviet defenders faced something perhaps more difficult than combat itself during these months: the knowledge that this state could continue indefinitely. The food supplies, while adequate for rationing, were not infinite. The ammunition production, while ongoing, could not match the consumption. The German army, conversely, was beginning to understand that a quick victory was no longer possible. Their logistical situation was precarious. The longer Sevastopol held out, the more resources continued to be poured into maintaining the siege. Command decisions were being made in Berlin and Moscow, in comfortable rooms far from the frozen ground outside the city, about whether the siege should continue at all. The winter, which had seemed like an enemy to both sides, had become something more subtle and strange, a form of stalemate, a temporary suspension of the question of victory or defeat. In this strange, frozen pause, life in the siege developed its own routines. Soldiers on both sides learned to endure the cold, to ration their warmth, to find small moments of comfort in the midst of deprivation. The defenders of Sevastopol knew that they were not being forgotten by Moscow, that supplies were still arriving, that attempts at relief or counter-offensive were still being contemplated. The besiegers knew that they were still under orders to take the city, but also knew that the time to do so was not measured in days any longer. And above it all, the winter sky remained grey, the wind continued to cut across the frozen steppe, and the distant artillery continued its strange, patient conversation with death. As November gave way to December, as the first real snow began to drift across the Crimean steppe, and the siege lines around Sevastopol hardened into something like a permanent fixture, an unexpected current of movement rippled through the broader Black Sea theatre. Far to the east, across the Kerch Strait where Europe's southernmost peninsula draws closest to Asia, the Soviets had been preparing something, a counteroffensive. Not to relieve Sevastopol directly, you understand, but to strike at the German forces from an entirely different direction, to force Manstein's attention sideways, to create what strategists call a dilemma of concentration. It was a bold wager, born partly from desperation and partly from a calculation that winter's grip might slow German momentum just enough to make such a landing possible. The operation itself, which historians would later name the Kerch-Feodosia landings, began on the morning of December 26, 1941. Picture, if you will, the waters of the Kerch Strait on that winter morning, cold, dark, churned by wind, and beneath it, filled with shallow draft landing craft and transport vessels moving through the pre-dawn darkness. The Soviets had assembled forces on the eastern shore, across the narrow strait in the Crimean Peninsula, and they were ferrying thousands of troops across toward the narrow strip of land that juts northward from Crimea itself. It was a pincer gesture, you might say, or perhaps the opening of a second front on the peninsula that Manstein believed he had already begun to compress into submission. The actual mechanics of such a landing, in deep winter, across contested water, deserve a moment of reflection. The Kerch Strait in December is not hospitable. The waters narrow to barely 3 miles in places, and they are shallow enough in many spots that ships must pick their passages carefully, as though walking on stones across a river. The Germans had air superiority in the region, or believed they did, and they had laid mines and established coastal defense positions. Yet the Soviets pressed forward with what was, by the standards of amphibious warfare in that era, remarkable coordination. Destroyers provided covering fire. Transport vessels, some hastily modified, none truly designed for such work, pushed their hulls across the water. Soldiers crowded onto decks, their breath steaming in the cold, their uniforms already beginning to stiffen with the spray of seawater that would freeze upon contact. What made this moment historically significant, and what draws our attention now through the fog of time, was not the landing itself in isolation. It was rather the sudden fracturing of German focus that it produced. Manstein found himself confronted, quite suddenly, with not one problem, but two. His armies on the peninsula could continue pressing against the walls of Sevastopol, yes, but now they were themselves vulnerable on the flank. A Soviet beachhead, growing day by day as more troops poured across the strait, represented a genuine threat to the German lines of supply and movement. Imagine the weight of that concern, the general's eye drawn suddenly outward, away from the prize he was already grasping, toward a new danger materializing on terrain he thought already conquered. The landings succeeded in achieving tactical surprise. The initial Soviet forces established themselves along the beaches near Feodosia, and then near Kerch itself, at the northernmost tip of the peninsula, creating two distinct lodgements. German coastal defense units, caught off guard by both the timing and the scope of the operation, fell back. Within the first 48 hours, some 15,000 Soviet troops had crossed the strait and dug in. Within the week, that number had swelled to perhaps 40,000, a significant force, though certainly not large enough to overwhelm Manstein's armies if they could be rapidly concentrated. And here emerges one of those curious historical tensions worth lingering upon. The Soviet command, particularly General Kozlov and his colleagues, directing operations from across the strait, had hoped that these landings would do more than create a diversion. They had harbored hopes, perhaps even optimistic hopes, that the beachhead could be rapidly expanded, that it could eventually link up with the defenders of Sevastopol, that somehow the encirclement could itself be encircled. It was a strategy that spoke to desperation as much as to rational military calculation, but desperation, in war, can sometimes breed audacity. Had the landings been even more successful, had the Germans been slower to respond, the entire complexion of the Sevastopol siege might have shifted. Instead, what happened was more complicated and, in its way, more typical of the grinding realities of World War II on the Eastern Front. Manstein, responding with characteristic decisiveness, detached sufficient forces to deal with the Soviet beachheads. The German commander's problem was that he could not ignore them, but neither could he entirely halt operations against Sevastopol itself. What emerged, therefore, was a kind of pause, not a cessation. The war, after all, recognized no such luxury, but a recalibration. German sorties against the Soviet positions at Kerch and Feodosia began almost immediately. The Luftwaffe, controlling the skies above the peninsula, made the narrow Kerch Strait a gauntlet of danger for any Soviet vessel attempting to reinforce or resupply the new beachheads. Through December and into the early weeks of January, a strange sort of three-sided struggle took shape across the Crimean Peninsula. The Germans pressed against both Sevastopol and the new Soviet positions, dividing their strength. The Soviets in Sevastopol waited and watched, and wondered if relief might come. The troops at Kerch and Feodosia fought to hold their ground against counterattacks that grew progressively stronger and more coordinated as German reinforcements arrived from other fronts. The Black Sea, which had seemed almost peripheral to the great movements of the war, suddenly became a theatre of genuine consequence, a place where the logistics of ancient empires intersected with the mechanized brutality of modern conflict. And yet, despite the initial successes of the Soviet landings, despite the moment of uncertainty they produced in the German high command, they ultimately failed to achieve their strategic objective. The encirclement of the Soviet beachheads proceeded with methodical German efficiency. By early February, the landings had been compressed, contained, pushed into a smaller and smaller space, their reinforcement becoming increasingly difficult, their survival increasingly questionable. The Soviets would maintain a presence in the Kerch Peninsula for several more months, but the moment of genuine possibility, the window in which they might have truly altered the course of the siege, had closed. Manstein's armies, after weathering this unexpected storm, returned their full attention to the compression of Sevastopol itself. What remained most significant about the Kerch-Feodosia landings, then, was perhaps not what they achieved, but what they revealed about the nature of military strategy in modern warfare. Even a well-executed counterstroke, even one that achieved tactical surprise and initial success, could be insufficient if the broader balance of force and resources tilted against it. The Soviets had shown imagination and courage, but imagination and courage, in the calculus of siege warfare, are often not quite enough. Still, for those brief weeks in late December and early January, the sky over Crimea had opened with possibility, and for the defenders of Sevastopol, even the rumor of relief, even the knowledge that their enemies faced pressure on another front, had been sustenance of a kind. It suggested that the world beyond the siege lines had not forgotten them, that somewhere their countrymen were still fighting, still trying to reach them, and in the dark of a besieged city, such knowledge, however uncertain its fruits, was never without value. While the siege tightened around Sevastopol's stone ramparts, and the artillery fell silent in those brief hours of winter darkness, another kind of war was unfolding across the water, far less visible to those watching from the cliff tops, but no less desperate in its own peculiar way. Somewhere in the cold Black Sea, beneath the surface or cutting through the dark swells with all lights doused, Soviet vessels moved with the careful purpose of those who knew that every journey might be their last. The lifeline of the besieged city did not rest entirely on land. It ran across the sea. The Germans controlled the skies above Sevastopol by day, and they had seeded the approaches with mines, but the Soviets had not surrendered the water entirely. A fleet of destroyers, not large by fleet standards, nevertheless carried supplies and occasionally ammunition out of the darkened ports of the Caucasus, Novorossiysk and Batumi, names that meant little to those outside that corner of the world, but everything to the men and women dying slowly inside the fortress. These were fast ships, agile enough to weave through the patrol lines when conditions favored them, and their crews had developed a grim expertise in the art of the dangerous run. Each voyage was a calculation of wind, cloud cover, German patrol patterns, and luck, a mathematics with lives in the denominator. Imagine the peculiar tension of those midnight hours when a Soviet destroyer, perhaps 300 or 400 meters long, its deck crew alert and silent, moved through waters that had been transformed into something between a battlefield and a minefield. The minesweepers had gone ahead when they could, cutting lanes through the deadly garden that the Luftwaffe had planted, but no corridor was ever entirely safe. The mines themselves, anchored charges that rose on their cables like hunting creatures suspended in the dark, waited with patient indifference. And above, once dawn began to break, or if the clouds lifted too thin, came the danger that haunted every captain's mind, the sound of aircraft engines. German Stuka dive bombers and twin-engined bombers had become feared across the Black Sea as the autumn of 1941 turned toward winter. They operated from airfields on the Crimean Peninsula itself, sometimes from the very mountains that ringed Sevastopol, which meant they could respond swiftly to any report of a Soviet vessel on the water. The destroyers were fast, perhaps 35 knots if you pushed them hard enough, but an aircraft traveling at 400 or 500 kilometers per hour in a steep dive was faster in the only way that mattered. The crew of a destroyer fleeing towards Sevastopol while under air attack could only do what their counterparts had done in every naval war of the modern age: maintain course toward the harbour, fire what anti-aircraft guns they possessed, and hope that the gunners above were having an off day. There is something particularly poignant about naval supply runs during a siege, perhaps because the sea itself is indifferent to the struggle. The water does not care whether the ships passing over it carry food for the hungry or shells for the guns. It simply swallows them if they sink, and the darkness below asks no questions. But the sailors knew precisely what they carried. They understood the weight of their cargo in terms that went beyond tonnage. Every sack of flour, every crate of medical supplies, every container of fuel oil meant that Sevastopol's garrison could hold on for another day, another week perhaps. The mathematics of siege warfare is always a race between supply and time, and every successful run compressed the timeline a little further. By the standards of conventional naval warfare, these were minor engagements. No battleships fired at one another, no great fleets maneuver for position. A single destroyer sunk in the Black Sea, in the winter darkness between Novorossiysk and Sevastopol, barely registers in the broader account of the war. And yet, the Soviet command treated these runs with the urgency of capital importance, because they understood what historians sometimes forget in their focus on grand strategy. A siege is ultimately decided not by the volume of shells falling on the defenders, but by how long the defenders can make their supplies last. The arithmetic of desperation is as real as the arithmetic of production. The submarines too moved through these waters, their commanders following the ancient predator's code of stealth and surprise. The Soviet Navy, in the autumn of 1941, had lost much in the initial German onslaught, but a handful of submarine captains had survived and adapted. They understood the Crimean waters better than most Germans ever would, the currents and the shallow shelves where a U-boat could hide in the murk. These men occasionally attempted their own supply runs, though a submarine's cargo capacity was infinitesimal compared to that of a destroyer. Perhaps a few tons of the most critical supplies, medicine, maybe some cipher materials or personnel who needed to leave the city. But they went out and came back, many times, a kind of underwater supply line that made almost no difference to the overall situation and yet represented an enormous commitment of risk on the part of the crews. The German Navy, such as it was in the Black Sea, could not easily contest these runs. The Luftwaffe was the guardian of those waters, and the Luftwaffe's authority was nearly absolute during daylight hours. The Kriegsmarine had a few small vessels, gunboats and minesweepers, but nothing that could stand against a Soviet destroyer in open combat. So the war for the waters around Sevastopol became primarily an aerial one, a contest between the dive bombers and fighters of the Luftwaffe and the anti-aircraft guns of the Soviet vessels and shore batteries. The fort guns of Sevastopol itself could sometimes reach out into the sea, adding their considerable weight to the defensive fire, and this too was part of the calculation. A run to Sevastopol was safer in some ways than a run to, say, Odessa further north, because the city's own defenses provided a kind of umbrella of fire once a destroyer came within range. As winter deepened through December and into January, these nightly runs became almost routine in their desperation. Night after night, when the moon was dark, or hidden by clouds, destroyers would slip out of Novorossiysk or other nearby ports, their holds loaded, their crews braced for either the mines below or the bombs from above. It is difficult to capture in words the particular exhaustion of such a pattern, the way routine and mortal danger can coexist until they seem almost normal, until a night voyage into a minefield under the threat of air attack becomes just another duty, like standing watch or maintaining engines. The sailors developed a kind of practiced fatalism, the calm that comes from understanding that the danger is real but consistent, that no amount of anxiety will change the outcome of a mine strike, and that somewhere in Sevastopol, people they had never met were depending on them to arrive. The supplies that came ashore from these runs were distributed according to careful priorities. The military received what it needed to continue the defense. The civilian population, which still numbered in the tens of thousands despite the bombardment and the evacuations, received rations that were adequate to sustain life, but barely, portions calculated to stretch supplies across months or longer if necessary. Every kilogram of flour that arrived on a destroyer in the winter darkness represented a few more meals for people who were hungry most of the time. The psychological value of such arrivals cannot be underestimated either. The simple knowledge that Sevastopol was not forgotten, that the wider Soviet state was still trying to supply the fortress, that people were still willing to risk their lives on the winter sea to deliver supplies. This mattered. And then there was the question of what could not be delivered. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against these supply runs was effective precisely because it did not have to sink many ships. If the risk became too great, if losses mounted too quickly, the runs would slow or stop. The Germans did not need to control the sea completely. They only needed to make the supply route so dangerous, so costly, that the Soviets could not sustain both the defense of Sevastopol and the losses incurred in supplying it. This too was a mathematics of war, though one conducted not with guns, but with probability and the careful calculation of acceptable casualties. As winter pressed on toward spring, the naval supply line would become increasingly important, because the second German assault was already being planned, and when it came, it would come with a fury that made the first attack seem almost preliminary. The destroyers and submarines moving through the darkness now, carrying their precious cargo, were buying time for Sevastopol's defenders, even if neither the sailors nor the soldiers knew exactly how much time remained. As winter loosened its grip on the Crimean Peninsula, as snow melted into slush and then vanished altogether from the higher ground, something shifted in the rhythm of the siege. The German commanders had learned, in those months of stalemate and bitter cold, that Sevastopol would not fall to a hasty thrust, that the Soviet defenders were far too deeply rooted, too well supplied by the sea, despite all the German air power arrayed against them, and so began a pause. Not a cessation of war, never that, but a deliberate, methodical gathering of force. All through the winter, supply lines had been quietly reorganized. Railways that ran deep into German-held Ukraine began to carry strange cargo, long flatbed wagons, specially reinforced, impossibly long, rumbled southward toward Crimea, laden with shapes that no one had quite seen before. Artillery, yes, but artillery of a wholly different magnitude. By April and early May of 1942, the true scale of what was coming became visible to those with eyes to see it. German engineers were constructing something near the siege lines, vast concrete emplacements, massive earthworks that seemed to serve no ordinary gun. Observation posts reported an atmosphere of anticipation among the German ranks, a sense that the real assault was being prepared not with the violence of the assault itself, but with the slow, patient accumulation of pure destructive power. The Germans had decided, it seemed, that they would not throw soldiers' lives at fortified walls. They would throw metal and explosives instead, so much of it that no wall could stand against it, no man could survive beneath it. It was a calculation, perhaps, born of frustration. The losses of the winter had been heavy. The siege would be decided not by courage, but by engineering, not by the speed of men, but by the patience of machines. And among those machines, two became legendary, or would become so in the decades that followed, the Gustav gun. Even now, more than 80 years later, the name carries a weight that is almost physical. If you were to stand beside it, you would understand why. It was perhaps the largest artillery piece ever built, certainly the largest ever fielded in active combat. To call it a gun is almost too small a word. It was a railway gun, meaning it was built to travel on specially constructed tracks, for no ordinary railway, no standard gauge, could bear such weight. The barrel alone, rifled steel with a bore of 804 millimeters, measured well over 30 meters in length. The entire weapon, when fully assembled, weighed more than 1,000 tons. Roughly 1,500 trained men were required simply to operate it, to move it, to feed it, to maintain it. Each shell it fired weighed nearly a ton. The muzzle velocity, the speed at which those shells left the barrel, was such that they could punch through meters of reinforced concrete, through solid rock, through any fortification the Soviet engineers had so carefully designed. How does one even imagine such a thing coming to existence? Picture, if you will, the vast Krupp works in Germany, those industrial cities of steel and smoke that had already become legendary for their war production. Somewhere there, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, engineers had begun to think about the ultimate siege gun. What would it look like? What could it do? What weight could it bear? The barrel took years to forge and machine. The breech mechanism alone was a marvel of precision engineering, as complex in its way as a watch, but scaled up to operate an 800mm gun. The gun house, the massive structure that surrounded and protected the mechanism, had to be so heavily armored that it could withstand counter-battery fire. And all of this had to move. Not move easily, not move quickly, but move nonetheless. By the spring of 1942, Gustav was being transported in pieces by rail toward Sevastopol. The journey itself took weeks. Special sections of track had to be surveyed, reinforced, sometimes entirely rebuilt to accommodate the weight. German sappers worked ahead of the convoy, inspecting rails, replacing worn sections, ensuring that this colossus could make its way down from the north. When Gustav finally arrived, the scale of it shocked even those who thought themselves prepared. It was assembled, from pieces, in a position overlooking the siege lines. The gun was so heavy, so powerful, that its recoil had to be absorbed by the railways upon which it sat, and those railways themselves had to give slightly with each shot, absorbing the violence of firing, then returning to position, rigid once more. A single shot from Gustav required careful calculation. The elevation had to be set. Wind conditions had to be observed. The target, usually one of the Soviet forts or a concentration of buildings in the city itself, had to be surveyed and confirmed. And then, perhaps, silence would fall, a tension would build, and then, the report of that gun would echo across the peninsula, a sound unlike any artillery most men had ever heard. It was not merely loud, it seemed to reshape the very air. And wherever that shell landed, concrete and stone and earth were simply removed. But Gustav was not alone. Arriving alongside it, assembled in other positions, was Karl, a sister gun, slightly smaller, less famous but no less devastating. Karl fired a shell of 600 millimeters, still an enormous weapon, still weighing hundreds of tons, still requiring armies of men to operate and maintain. Where Gustav might fire 4 or 5 shells a day, Karl could manage somewhat more rapid fire, though the term rapid here is relative. Still, the arrival of 2 such weapons fundamentally altered the mathematics of the siege. The Soviets knew what was coming. Scouts, agents, radio intercepts all confirmed it. The Germans were building up for a final, massive assault, one that would be preceded by a bombardment of historically unprecedented scale. The artillery pieces were being positioned, the ammunition was being stockpiled, the assault units were being concentrated in forward areas, preparing for the breakthrough that could no longer be delayed, no longer eased away by the slow attrition of winter. What must it have felt like to be inside Sevastopol in those weeks, knowing that these machines were being assembled just beyond the siege lines? It was, perhaps, like living in the shadow of an approaching storm that one could see gathering, but could not flee. The city had survived 4 months already. The people had learned to endure bombardment, to find shelter in the deep forts and the carved-out bunkers beneath the streets. But this was different. The arrival of Gustav and Karl suggested a new intensity, a new determination on the German side, as if all the previous months had been merely preliminary, as if the real assault was only now about to begin. As the spring of 1942 deepened across the Russian steppes, an engineering challenge unlike any other in modern warfare was quietly unfolding in the German Reich. The weapon that would transform the Siege of Sevastopol was not a thing that could be assembled on a battlefield or hastily constructed from available materials. The gun Gustav, as it came to be known, represented perhaps the most ambitious expression of industrial siege power ever attempted in warfare, and understanding how such a weapon came to exist requires us to step backward for a moment, away from the front lines and into the foundries and design offices where men conceived of instruments of destruction on a scale that seems almost unimaginable to modern ears. The creation of a siege gun of such magnitude began not with an order, but with a question. German engineers, contemplating the Soviet fortifications that ringed Sevastopol, asked themselves, what would it take to breach walls and bunkers so heavily reinforced that conventional artillery fire seemed almost ineffective? The answer they arrived at was overwhelming mass. A projectile, if it were heavy enough, if it fell with enough force from a high enough trajectory, could penetrate barriers that smaller shells could only chip away at, and so the concept began to develop. The design itself was a feat of calculation and imagination. The barrel alone would need to be impossibly long to stabilize such a massive projectile. The breech mechanism would need to withstand pressures that conventional metalwork could scarcely contain. The ammunition would be so large that loading it into the weapon would require mechanical assistance, and the recoil would need to be managed by systems of hydraulic buffers and counter-recoil springs that had to be engineered with extraordinary precision. The Gustav gun, when finally completed, stood 47 meters long from muzzle to breech. To place that in perspective, imagine a structure taller than a 13-story building, but instead of reaching upward, it stretched horizontally, a tube of steel pointing toward a distant target. The gun itself weighed 1,344 tons. The shell it fired weighed approximately 7.5 tons, a projectile so vast that when it was loaded into the breech, it required a mechanical hoist and careful coordination among the crew. The gun's traverse mechanism, the system that allowed it to rotate left and right, was powered by electric motors, and the elevation, the angle at which the barrel pointed skyward, was controlled with such precision that a single gunner could adjust the angle by tiny increments to ensure the shell landed exactly where it was intended. But a gun of such proportions presents a logistical puzzle that is almost as complex as its engineering. How do you move such a weapon? The answer, in the spring of 1942, involved railways. The Gustav gun could only be transported by specially designed railway carriages. It would need to be disassembled into sections, loaded onto these carriages, and then transported by rail to the designated firing position near Sevastopol. The journey itself took weeks. The gun would need to travel from the German artillery proving grounds, through Poland, across the vast distances of the Russian steppes, avoiding air attack, and remaining undetected for as long as possible. When it finally arrived at its destination, it could not simply be positioned anywhere. The terrain had to be surveyed. A concrete and steel platform had to be constructed to distribute the weapon's enormous weight and to manage the recoil forces that would be generated when it fired. Wooden sleepers and rails, sometimes yards in length, had to be laid to support the firing position. The entire operation required hundreds of workers, engineers, and soldiers, all coordinating their efforts to bring this single weapon into action. And then there was the question of the ammunition itself. The shells fired by the Gustav gun were not simple projectiles. They were sophisticated weapons, carefully balanced and shaped to deliver their destructive potential with maximum efficiency. The smaller of the two types of ammunition used, and there were two, a conventional high-explosive shell, and a specialized armor-piercing round, weighed around 4.8 tons. It would take a special ammunition hoist to load it into the gun. The larger rounds, the high-explosive shells, were even more massive. These projectiles contained hundreds of kilograms of explosive material, carefully arranged within the shell's metal casing to maximize the blast effect upon detonation. The fuses had to be set with extreme precision because the difference between a detonation at the right moment and one that was fractionally off could mean the difference between a successful breach and a wasted shot. Each shell cost enormous amounts of material and money, and ammunition production became a constraint on how frequently the Gustav could be fired. The weapon was not a tool for continuous bombardment. It was designed for specific moments, targeted strikes against specific fortifications. What did it mean, then, to be on the receiving end of such a weapon? To be a defender in Sevastopol, sheltered in a concrete bunker or a stone fort, hearing the distant rumble as the Gustav fired its shell across the miles of open ground. The sound would arrive first, a low concussive boom that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Then, if the shell was coming toward your position, there would be a brief, almost negligible warning, the high-pitched scream of the projectile as it fell through the air. And then impact. The concussion of a 7.5-ton shell striking earth or stone would generate a shockwave that could be felt through solid rock, that could collapse lungs and rupture eardrums from the sheer acoustic violence of it. The blast crater would be enormous, a scar in the landscape that seemed almost geological in scale. The fragmentation pattern would spread across hundreds of meters. To be anywhere near the impact zone was to risk not merely injury, but annihilation. Yet the gun, for all its awesome destructive power, had limitations that its designers had perhaps not fully anticipated. It could only fire a handful of rounds per day. The rate of fire was determined by the time it took to cool the barrel, to load the next shell, and to traverse the weapon to its next target. It was vulnerable to air attack, and German air superiority, which had seemed so assured in the early days of the invasion, was beginning to erode by the spring of 1942. It was fixed in position, unable to relocate quickly if the tactical situation demanded it. And most importantly, perhaps, it was a tool designed to break static defenses, not to defeat an enemy that might choose to abandon those defenses and withdraw. The Gustav gun would prove devastatingly effective against the fortifications of Sevastopol, but only if those fortifications were worth the extraordinary effort required to bring such a weapon into action. For the defenders, knowing that such a weapon existed, knowing that somewhere behind the German siege lines an enormous barrel was being aimed at their positions, represented a psychological burden almost as heavy as the physical destruction the gun could inflict. When the spring rains finally retreated from the Crimean Peninsula in early June of 1942, the German gunners were ready. For months, they had positioned their siege artillery along the ridges and plateaus that ringed Sevastopol from the north and east, dragging enormous cannon over rutted roads and through the steppe dust, positioning crews with methodical patience. The Soviet defenders had watched this accumulation with the quiet dread of those who know what is coming but cannot stop it. And when dawn broke on June 2nd, the waiting ended. The bombardment that began that morning was unlike anything the city or its defenders had yet endured. The scale of it was simply difficult to comprehend. Within the first hours alone, German artillery pieces fired more shells than had been lobbed at Sevastopol in all the preceding months combined. The sound was not sharp or singular, but rather a continuous, overwhelming roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, as though the peninsula were splitting open at its seams. Soldiers in the underground shelters and fortified bunkers felt the concussions more than they heard them, felt the ground beneath them rise and settle with each successive impact, felt the ancient limestone and reinforced concrete absorb the shock waves and transfer them through their bones. The dust was perhaps the most insidious part, as the German shells tore into the Sevastopol fortifications, as they cracked the masonry of coastal forts and collapsed earthwork parapets. They released clouds of pulverized stone and soil that hung in the warm June air like a pale fog. Visibility on the front lines shrank to mere yards. Men could not see their own hand extended before their face. They breathed the dust with each exhausted breath, felt it coating their throats and settling in their lungs, felt it sting their eyes until tears ran down cheeks already grimy with soot and blood. The dust became a presence, almost a living thing, smothering sound and vision alike, isolating each soldier or small group in their own small circle of grey chaos. The Gustav gun and its sister piece, the massive railroad-mounted Karl, were firing almost constantly now. The Gustav itself, that colossal siege howitzer that had been wheeled into position after months of engineering labour, could hurl its enormous shell with such force and over such distance that the very ground shook perceptibly several miles away. Soldiers who had never seen it, who could not see it through the dust and distance, nevertheless felt its presence. They knew when it fired because of the peculiar way the entire landscape seemed to pause and quiver, as though holding its breath before the impact came. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, and devastating. The gun crew had time between firings to adjust, to recalibrate, to ensure that their next contribution to the bombardment would find its mark among the Soviet fortifications that sprawled across the hills. But there was something peculiar about the way the defenders endured this. Perhaps it was fatigue, or perhaps it was a kind of resignation born from months of siege. The Soviet soldiers in the forts had already lived through so much: the initial German drive into Crimea, the autumn encirclement, the long winter of short rations and constant cold. They had seen friends die in the trenches and from the slow drain of hunger and disease. They had watched the supply situation grow tighter with each passing week as German submarines and aircraft interdicted the convoys trying to run through the Black Sea. By June, there was a peculiar mental state that had settled over the defenders, a kind of exhausted acceptance that combined defiance with an almost numb endurance. In the forts themselves, Maxim Gorky with its massive gun turrets, the smaller bastions and redoubts scattered along the coastal heights, the crews of naval gunners and rifle companies pressed themselves against walls and sheltered in the deepest bunkers they could find. The roar of the German bombardment was constant, almost rhythmic in its relentlessness. It would rise in intensity for periods, then ebb slightly, only to surge again. Some of the sailors who had once served aboard Soviet destroyers now manned the fixed gun positions in the forts, directing fire against the German gun positions they could barely see through the dust and smoke. Others crouched in ammunition magazines and ready rooms, passing shells hand to hand, waiting for orders, trying not to count the hours or think about what might happen if the Germans broke through. What strikes one as curious, when reading the accounts left by those who were there, is how precisely recorded these bombardments were by both sides. The Germans kept meticulous records of their ammunition expended, their gun positions, the estimated damage inflicted. The Soviets, despite their dire circumstances and the chaos of the shelling, kept logs and reports that documented the falling shells, the damage to specific fortifications, the casualties among their defending troops. How do men maintain such discipline, such attention to detail, in the midst of such overwhelming violence? Perhaps it is the opposite of distraction. Perhaps precise record-keeping becomes a kind of anchor to sanity, a way of imposing order on chaos. The civilian experience within the city during the bombardment was different but no less harrowing. Sevastopol had once been home to nearly 300,000 people. By June, most had either been evacuated by sea, fled to the countryside, or died in the preceding months. Those who remained, elderly citizens unable or unwilling to leave, workers still deemed essential, families who had somehow slipped through the evacuation nets, huddled in cellars and caves, listening to the endless percussion of the German guns. The basements of stone buildings offered some protection, but they were dark and damp and foul with the smell of so many people crowded together in such a small space. When a particularly close impact came, dust and fragments would sift down from the ceiling, settling on clothes and skin, a constant reminder of the thin separation between them and the shells falling above. The bombardment continued day after day, June 2nd, 3rd, 4th. The days blurred together in a continuous roar. The water supply to the city had been damaged in the opening hours of the barrage. Food, already rationed to near starvation levels, grew even scarcer as supplies continued to be cut off. Medical personnel worked in the underground hospitals, the very caverns and tunnels that Sevastopol's Tsarist planners had meant for storage and shelter, operating on wounded men by electric light, their hands shaking with exhaustion and lack of food, with the knowledge that more wounded would keep coming as long as the bombardment continued. The heat of June settled over the ruins, and with it came the smell of smoke, of dust, of things burning that should not burn. Yet the fortifications held. The engineers and gun crews who had designed and built the Soviet coastal defenses had done their work well. The forts were not invulnerable. Nothing could be, faced with the sheer weight of steel and explosives that the Germans were pouring into them. But they were resilient. Walls that were blasted would hold firm, though cracked. Gun turrets that were hit would be damaged but rarely completely destroyed. The defenders within them endured the bombardment, as men and women have endured such things throughout history, through a combination of courage and resignation, of holding to their posts because there was nowhere else to go, and because to abandon them would mean immediate death anyway. They fired back when they could, their own artillery responding to German gun flashes glimpsed through the dust, their rifle companies maintaining their positions along the fortified lines. How long can a human being withstand such an experience? Days of continuous bombardment, of living in or near the impact zone of artillery fire, of breathing dust-choked air and subsisting on minimal food and water. The body and mind reach a state that is difficult for those who have not experienced it to comprehend. Soldiers reported periods of almost dreamlike clarity, alternating with moments of panic or despair. Some found themselves weeping uncontrollably at minor setbacks, while others became almost mechanically efficient, their actions performed with automatic precision, born from training and repetition. The human capacity for endurance is vast, deeper than most realize, but it has limits, and by the end of the first week of the bombardment, those limits were beginning to show. The dust never quite cleared, even on the quiet nights when the German guns fell silent. It hung in the air like a permanent fog, coating every surface, settling into every wound and every shelter. If one were to walk through Sevastopol in those days, which few could, given the constant danger, one would have seen a landscape transformed. The elegant Tsarist-era buildings that had survived the autumn and winter were now rubble. The carefully planned gardens and boulevards were torn and gouged. The quiet beauty that had once drawn visitors to the city was being methodically erased, replaced by a landscape of craters and broken stone. And yet, within the fortifications, among the soldiers and sailors and gun crews and the remaining civilians, there was a grim determination that the bombardment alone, terrible as it was, would not break them. By early July, the defenders of Sevastopol knew what the calendar meant. They had held through the bombardment, through the terrible weight of German artillery that had turned limestone hills into dust and pulverized the city block by block. The numerical advantage had begun to shift decisively. The Soviet commander, General Ivan Petrov, understood that the mathematics of the siege no longer favored resistance, not in terms of ammunition, not in terms of fresh reinforcements, not in terms of time itself, which had become the scarcest resource of all. Fort Maxim Gorky, that engineering marvel with its massive gun turrets and underground galleries, stood on the western approaches to the city. For months, it had been a defiant heartbeat in the Soviet defense, its 305mm guns reaching out across the harbor and toward the advancing German lines. But by the first days of July, the fort had endured so much concentrated fire that its very structure seemed to be dissolving. The Germans had learned, through bitter experience and countless dead soldiers, that frontal assault against such a position was futile. Instead, they pressed methodically inward, tightening the noose, collapsing the perimeter yard by yard, trench by trench. The fall of Maxim Gorky did not happen in a single dramatic moment, though soldiers on both sides might have wished for such clarity. Instead, It unfolded across several days of increasingly desperate fighting in the rubble and fortifications surrounding the main fort. German engineers, moving forward under cover of suppressing fire, worked to destroy the defensive obstacles and approach the gun turrets themselves. Soviet defenders, their numbers dwindling from casualties and exhaustion, moved between underground shelters and firing positions, knowing that each withdrawal meant the German lines drew closer to the heart of their remaining defenses. Consider, if you will, what it meant for a soldier to live in those final hours of the fort's resistance. He would have descended into tunnels built decades before, constructed during the Crimean War and expanded through the Soviet era, and found himself in a world lit by oil lamps and the occasional flash of nearby explosions. Water dripped from the ceiling, the air was thick with moisture, and the smell of concrete, metal, and human exhaustion. Above ground, his comrades manned the remaining gun positions, and with each passing hour, fewer of them remained to do so. The Germans were pressing from multiple directions now, their infantry moving through the suburbs of Sevastopol itself, their sappers working to breach the fort's outer defenses. The fighting in the city's suburbs during these same days took on a quality of grim inevitability. Street by street, the defenders fell back toward the harbour. These were not clean tactical withdrawals, but desperate, rearguard actions, with squads of Soviet soldiers making stands in bombed-out buildings, in cellars, behind rubble barricades. The Germans, for their part, had learned through months of siege warfare to move carefully, to expect machine gun fire from unexpected angles, to account for the booby traps and improvised defenses that Soviet engineers had woven throughout the urban landscape. What is perhaps most striking, when one examines the records and testimonies from this period, is the way resistance was measured now, not in territorial gains or strategic objectives, but in something far more precious: endurance itself. A Soviet platoon commander who managed to hold a city block for another day, who withdrew in good order and inflicted casualties on the advancing Germans, who ensured that his remaining men found shelter in another basement or another fortified position, had in some sense succeeded. The whole calculus of the siege had shifted. Success was no longer victory but survival, not conquest, but the maintenance of order and discipline in the face of inevitable defeat. The naval gunners in Fort Maxim Gorky and the smaller coastal batteries continued to fire as long as they had ammunition and functioning guns. The psychological significance of these weapons could hardly be overstated. They represented Soviet resistance, Soviet defiance, the notion that, even as the city was being carved away, the defenders still reached out with steel and fire toward their enemies. But as July deepened, the ammunition trucks no longer arrived. The supply lines had been cut. What shells remained were counted with the care one might count the days in a calendar, each round a precious, finite thing. The infantry battles through the suburbs created a strange fragmentation of the battlefield. No longer was there a coherent Soviet line, a clear demarcation between defense and attack. Instead, there were pockets of resistance, islands of soldiers and civilians sheltering in apartment buildings and fortified positions, separated from one another, communicating by runner when possible, cut off and surrounded when the Germans moved quickly enough. Some of these pockets held out longer than others. Some chose to surrender rather than face annihilation. Others fought until ammunition was exhausted, until no able-bodied defenders remained. Think on this. If the thought can settle gently into your mind, these were soldiers and sailors who understood, with absolute clarity, that their position was hopeless. They had received no orders to hold to the last man, no grand exhortations to sacrifice themselves for the motherland. They simply continued doing what soldiers do. They held their positions, they fired their weapons, they moved when ordered, they sheltered when possible. And yet, by holding on, by refusing the quick surrender that might have saved their lives, they made the Germans fight for every street corner, every ruined apartment building, every fortified cellar. The civilians still remaining in the city, and there were still thousands of them, despite earlier evacuations, lived in a world compressed to the immediate vicinity of whatever shelter they occupied. A mother might spend her day in an underground passage with her children, emerging only when absolutely necessary to find water or food. An old man might tend to wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital, working by candlelight in the lower levels of a damaged building, knowing that above him, the city was being torn apart. Their experience of the siege's final days was not one of grand historical events but of hunger, cold, danger, and the quiet companionship of others enduring the same. By the middle of July, the German commanders sensed the imminent collapse. They pressed harder, threw more men into the assault, risked heavier casualties in the knowledge that the victory was within reach, and the Soviet resistance, however fierce in individual instances, could no longer be sustained at the scale required to stop the German advance. Fort Maxim Gorky, which had been a fortress of hope in earlier months, became a fortress of farewell. As the final positions were overrun, as the last gun positions fell silent, the symbol of Soviet defiance in the Black Sea was extinguished, not in a spectacular explosion, but in the grinding, mournful reality of soldiers making their last stand in tunnels beneath the earth. What remains, across the decades that have passed since those days, is a kind of quiet tribute to the simple fact of resistance itself. The defenders of Sevastopol and its forts did not save the city. They did not defeat the German army. They did not change the course of the war. But they made the conquest of Sevastopol costly. They maintained their discipline and dignity under circumstances designed to destroy both. They held on for days when hours might have been expected, and weeks when days would have been remarkable. In doing so, they created a monument not of stone or steel, but of human endurance, of the capacity to continue when continuation seems impossible. The sound of the siege in its final moments was, paradoxically, quieter than in the full fury of the bombardment. This was not peace but exhaustion. This was not stillness, but the careful movements of soldiers in the rubble, the whispered commands, the isolated cracks of rifle fire rather than the sustained roar of artillery. And beneath all of it, underlying every moment of those final days, was the knowledge that time had run out, that the resistance could not be sustained, that the siege which had defined Sevastopol for nearly a year was entering its final chapter, or perhaps, to be more precise, was already writing it. In those final days of June, as the German artillery hammered without mercy, and the Soviet defensive perimeter shrank to little more than rubble and desperate handholds, a single thought consumed the minds of thousands huddled in bunkers and cellars beneath the dying city. The sea, the open water to the south and east, where ships might still come, where escape remained possible, where some fraction of the garrison and civilians could perhaps be spirited away before the fortress fell entirely into German hands. It was a fragile hope, and in the logistics of war under total siege, hope becomes a currency far more precious than ammunition or food. The Soviet command in Moscow understood what was happening. Admiral Isakov, coordinating naval operations from distant Batumi, received increasingly urgent messages about the deteriorating situation in Sevastopol. The city, which had endured over 200 days of bombardment and infantry assault, was approaching its collapse. Not because the defenders had lost their will, they had not, but because the sheer mathematics of attrition cannot be denied forever. Every gun destroyed is one fewer to return fire. Every soldier killed or wounded is one fewer to hold the line. Every day of siege stretches the limits of human endurance a little further. The evacuation plan was not a new invention. Throughout the previous winter and spring, smaller evacuation operations had taken place, pulling out the wounded, some civilian officials, crucial military personnel, but these were trickles, measured in the hundreds. What was now contemplated, in those sultry last days of June, was something far more ambitious and vastly more difficult. If the defense was to collapse, and collapse seemed now inevitable, then perhaps several thousand people, soldiers who could not be replaced, wounded men, some of the remaining civilians, engineers whose skills the Soviet state needed, could be withdrawn by sea in a final, desperate movement under darkness and cover of naval fire. The Black Sea Fleet was diminished. German air power had exacted a terrible price over 18 months. Yet submarines still operated in the murky waters. Destroyers and smaller naval vessels, though never numerous enough, continued to show themselves around the besieged peninsula. The question was whether enough ships could be mustered, whether they could reach the beaches and evacuation points near the city, and whether they could do so before German guns and aircraft made such an operation suicidal. Cape Chersonesus, the rocky promontory that juts into the sea at the southern extremity of Sevastopol's defences, became the focal point of this final, aching endeavour. The Cape, with its ancient Greek ruins and its modern forts, still resolutely firing their last shells at the encroaching Germans, offered at least some possibility of concealment from the advancing infantry. Small beaches and rocky inlets provided places where small boats might reach the shore. It was not ideal. No evacuation under fire ever is. But it was what remained, and so it became the stage for the last act of Sevastopol's defense. On the nights of June 29th and 30th, and into the first days of July, Soviet naval vessels made their way toward the fortress. Fast destroyers, their decks cleared for cargo and humanity rather than ammunition, slipped through waters where German mines still drifted like invisible threats. Submarines, their hulls groaning under the strain of dangerous transit at depth, moved into position to receive evacuees by way of rubber boats and smaller craft. The operation was conducted largely under cover of darkness, a thin veil against the all-seeing German Air Force that now dominated the skies above Sevastopol. Those chosen for evacuation faced a cruel sorting process. Not everyone could leave. The ships had limited capacity. A destroyer might carry perhaps 400 or 500 personnel in addition to her crew, and even that was uncomfortable. Even that left men standing in passageways and on open decks. Orders came down from the high command in Moscow. Lists were drawn up, and difficult decisions were made by officers who knew that many of those left behind would not survive to the end of the siege. Wounded officers were prioritized. Communist Party officials received places. Skilled technicians and engineers whose knowledge was deemed essential to future Soviet military production were marked for extraction. Many of the ordinary soldiers, the men who had bled and suffered and held their ground through 250 days of hell, were told they would have to remain. Some sources suggest, though verification is difficult through the fog of war and propaganda, that several thousand personnel were successfully evacuated. Others contradict this, claiming the numbers were far smaller. The historical record, inevitably, is obscured by the chaos of the moment and by the different accounts given by survivors, some writing years later from memory, others never writing at all. What is certain is that ships came, that some people departed, and that the overwhelming majority of those fighting in Sevastopol did not. The evacuation itself was conducted in scenes that haunt the historical record. Men waded into the black water from hidden coves, moving quietly so as not to attract German fire, though the Germans, aware of the naval activity, attacked the beaches with artillery and sporadic airstrikes. The wounded were carried on stretchers through rocky terrain, some men so injured that the movement reopened wounds or hastened their descent into shock. Officers stood on the beaches, checking lists against the faces of those before them, knowing they were condemning someone to likely death with each name they did not call. The smaller vessels, minesweepers, submarines, even civilian boats pressed into service, were the lifelines. They would approach the rocky shores, and for a handful of minutes, which felt like hours to those awaiting rescue, they would take aboard whoever could climb or be lifted aboard. Then, with German shells beginning to find their range, and enemy aircraft perhaps minutes away, the ships would turn and depart, leaving the beaches empty again, leaving thousands of eyes watching their departure with an anguish that history barely acknowledges. One might wonder what thoughts occupied the minds of those left behind, standing on those beaches as the last ship's lights disappeared into the darkness. The relief of some who had never expected rescue was perhaps mingled with the despair of those who had, and for whom that despair now solidified into an absolute understanding of their fate. Yet the historical record suggests a strange steadiness. These were soldiers. They had known, or believed they had known, what this siege might entail when they took their positions among the forts and ruins. Whether that knowledge was truly a comfort in the face of the end is a question each man would have had to answer in his own way, in the silence of his own mind. Not all the evacuation was by naval vessel. Some attempts were made to slip men and women out overland, toward the northeast, hoping to break through the German encirclement or to reach areas where resistance might still be organized. Most of these attempts ended in failure. The Germans, understanding what was afoot, tightened their cordon. Small groups of Soviet personnel, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes they had scrounged, moved through the hills and ravines in the darkness. Some were captured, some were killed. Whether any succeeded in breaking through entirely and reaching Soviet-held territory is known to history only in fragmentary, conflicting accounts. By the time the first light of July 4th broke over Sevastopol, the evacuation was over. No more ships came. The German noose, which had been merely constricting for so long, became absolute. The defenders faced not a siege in the classical sense, but an ending, the final, unavoidable conclusion to a long and terrible contest. The remaining garrison, perhaps 15,000 or 20,000 Soviet soldiers and officers, faced either capture, surrender, or death. Some, according to reports that have persisted into the post-war years, chose not to face capture. Some killed themselves. Some fought on in small pockets, in cellars and rubble, until German stormtroopers flushed them out, or until shells and fire ended the matter. The evacuation of Sevastopol, in those dark final nights, was neither a triumph nor a complete failure. It was a salvage operation, a desperate attempt to preserve something from the wreckage of a long struggle. Whether those evacuated numbered in the high thousands or low hundreds, whether the operation was a significant success or merely a gesture of defiance against the inevitable, remains a matter of historical discussion and sometimes dispute. What is beyond question is that most who fought in Sevastopol did not leave it. They remained, in rubble and graves, in the memory of survivors who would carry the siege forward through the rest of their lives, and in the slow, quiet rebuilding that would eventually restore the city from ruin, though never quite erasing the marks that such violence leaves upon a place. By early July, the final Soviet garrison holding the northeastern quarter of Sevastopol had begun to understand that their position, already reduced to rubble and ash, had become untenable. The German encirclement had tightened into a stranglehold. Supply ships could no longer break through the Luftwaffe's blockade. Water, in a coastal city surrounded by the sea, had become impossibly scarce. The wounded filled every cellar and dugout, and there was almost no morphine left, almost no bandages that had not been used and reused until they disintegrated in the hands of exhausted field surgeons working by candlelight in the earth beneath the ruins above them. On the 3rd of July, the order came down through the Soviet command structure. Those who could be evacuated would depart that night. Small boats and submarines, operating under cover of darkness, began threading their way toward the last defensive positions. But the numbers of people who wished to leave, who needed to leave, far exceeded the capacity of those vessels. Soviet officers made terrible choices in those hours. Which soldiers would be taken? Which would remain to cover the withdrawal? Which civilians, and there were still thousands sheltering in the fortified tunnels of the old Tsarist forts, would have any chance at all of reaching the water? The evacuation itself was a kind of controlled chaos, conducted in near silence. Thousands of men, women, and children moving through darkened streets toward the harbour, knowing that daylight would bring German artillery and aircraft. Some records suggest that somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people were taken off that final night. Others remained. Some chose to stay and fight to the last moment. Others found themselves simply left behind when the boats departed, watching the dark water swallow the only escape route they would ever be offered. When dawn broke on July 4, 1942, Sevastopol was still nominally in Soviet hands, but only because there were still Soviet soldiers there to defend it, and only just barely. The German forces that now flooded into the remaining Soviet-held districts encountered not resistance in any organized sense, but rather pockets of men determined to make a last stand, even though the outcome was no longer in doubt. In the rubble of what had once been the city's commercial quarter, in the basement of a school that had been converted into a makeshift hospital, in the trenches dug through the wreckage of fortifications that had endured 3 centuries of history, Soviet soldiers fought and died, knowing that the city they were dying for was already, in every meaningful sense, already gone. The formal surrender came sometime in the early afternoon of July 4th, though even the precise moment is contested in the historical record, perhaps because surrender itself felt redundant when there was so little left to surrender. What remained of the Soviet command in Sevastopol, lacking any possibility of further supply, facing enemies on all sides, and with their troops reduced to a fraction of their original strength, capitulated. German troops, themselves exhausted and depleted by months of siege warfare, moved through the ruins and began the grim work of accounting for what they had won and what it had cost them. The human toll of the Sevastopol siege staggers the imagination even now, decades later, when we have the luxury of viewing it with some temporal distance. Soviet military casualty figures remain uncertain. The loss of records, the fog of war, the Soviet Union's own complicated relationship with casualty statistics, all of these have left historians debating the precise numbers. But by most estimates, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Soviet soldiers died during the 8-month siege, either in combat or from disease and wounds sustained in conditions of appalling deprivation. Many thousands more were captured and entered the German prisoner of war system, where their fates varied wildly depending on where they were held and under what conditions. The civilian losses were no less devastating. Perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 civilian residents of Sevastopol died during the siege, from artillery fire, from aerial bombardment, from starvation and disease, and the simple accumulated trauma of living beneath continuous assault for month after month. Some fled the city before the siege tightened. Some evacuated on those desperate final night boats, but many simply vanished into the historical record, their names and stories lost in the chaos and documentation of war. The Soviet city had been, in its way, almost obliterated. For the German forces under von Manstein, the cost was also steep, though less absolutely than for the defenders. German casualty estimates suggest roughly 24,000 killed, wounded, or missing during the entire Crimean campaign and the siege proper. The 11th Army had achieved its objective, but its strength was so depleted that it would never again be capable of the kind of prolonged offensive operations it had conducted in 1941 and 1942. In a very real sense, the 8-month battle for Sevastopol, even in German victory, had exhausted forces that the German High Command could ill afford to lose. The immediate aftermath of the fall was confusion and suffering, compounded by its own weight. German soldiers moved through the rubble in the summer heat, and the smell of death, from the corpses still trapped beneath collapsed buildings, from the bodies lying in the fortifications, from the impromptu mass graves that had been dug in haste, that smell became almost a physical presence that many survivors never quite forgot. Soviet prisoners were gathered and marched toward detention camps. The German occupation authorities began the process of establishing control over a city that had been, quite literally, fought over block by block, street by street, until there were scarcely any intact streets left. And yet, beneath the suffering and the loss and the devastation, something rather remarkable began almost immediately. Within days of the German occupation, some of the captured Soviet soldiers and captured civilians who remained in Sevastopol began the work of clearing rubble, identifying bodies, and attempting to establish basic sanitation systems in a city where hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians, had been living in underground fortifications with minimal access to clean water or medical care. It was grim work, often conducted under the observation of German occupiers, and it was work that had to be done because the alternative was plague. By the autumn of 1942, a tenuous kind of normalcy, if that word can even apply to an occupied city, in the midst of a global war, had begun to establish itself. German authorities controlled Sevastopol, but the city's Russian population, those who had not fled, those who had not been evacuated, those who had survived the siege, continued to inhabit it, and they began the slow work of rebuilding even as the German occupation continued. Shops reopened in partially intact buildings. Schools attempted to resume some kind of instruction. The harbour, which had been the scene of naval warfare and underwater mines and desperate evacuation attempts, became a German military installation. But the broader story of Sevastopol during the German occupation is beyond the scope of our immediate journey. What matters is the fact that the city fell, and in falling, it marked a kind of culmination of the massive German offensive into southern Russia that had begun so promisingly in June of 1941. The conquest of Sevastopol did not save the German war effort. In fact, the very resources expended in its conquest, the time, the artillery, the manpower, might well have been better deployed elsewhere. Even as German troops raised their flags over the ruins of the Soviet fortifications in July 1942, the larger strategic situation on the Eastern Front was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Stalingrad loomed ahead, with its own terrible siege and its own different outcome. The post-war rebuilding of Sevastopol was as extraordinary in its way as the siege itself had been. The Soviet Union, having survived the German invasion and emerged victorious, poured resources into the reconstruction of Sevastopol as both a practical necessity and a kind of monument to Soviet endurance. By the early 1950s, many of the destroyed buildings had been reconstructed. The harbour was restored. The naval installations that had made Sevastopol so strategically valuable were rebuilt and expanded. The city that had been reduced to rubble in 1942 was, by the 1960s, once again a functioning Black Sea port and a Soviet naval base of considerable importance. But the marks of the siege remained visible for decades. If you had walked through Sevastopol in the 1950s, you would still have seen buildings that bore the scars of artillery fire, the pockmarks of shrapnel, the charred walls of structures that had been burned in the fighting. You would have seen gaps in the urban landscape where buildings had been so completely destroyed that they had simply been demolished rather than rebuilt. The cemeteries held thousands of graves of men and women who had died during those 8 months. The forts themselves, Maxim Gorky and the others, became memorials and museums to the siege, their massive guns still pointing outward toward the sea, as if standing eternal watch against some future assault that never came. The human cost of the Sevastopol siege, ultimately, cannot be reduced to statistics. Yes, there were perhaps 300,000 or more total casualties on both sides, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Yes, the German victory, whatever its tactical success, did not prevent the eventual Soviet victory in the larger war. But what endures most powerfully in accounts of Sevastopol, in the memoirs of survivors, and in the historical records, is the individual human experience of the siege. The soldier in a fortification watching the German artillery approach his position, the mother sheltering her children in an underground tunnel, rationing their water, and doing what she could to keep them calm, despite the constant roar of explosions above. The young man, perhaps 20 years old, ordered to hold a position he knew could not be held, doing so anyway, because that was what he had been ordered to do. The nurse working without morphine, trying to ease suffering she could not alleviate. These are the human dimensions of the siege, and they are in some ways more moving, more difficult to contemplate than the grand historical narratives of military campaigns and territorial conquest. As the decades passed and the Cold War deepened, and the Soviet Union eventually dissolved and reformed as Russia, Sevastopol remained what it had become during the war, a place where the past lived very close to the surface. The siege became embedded in the city's identity. School children learned the dates and the names of the fallen. The anniversary of the city's fall was commemorated annually. Monuments to the defenders were erected and maintained. The city's residents, Russian and Ukrainian alike, carried the memory of the siege as something both intimate and distant, a story about their city and their place, but also a story about a war that had ended long before they were born. Today, if you were to stand on one of the heights overlooking Sevastopol, the harbour at Sevastopol is quiet now, in a way that those who lived through the siege might have struggled to imagine. The limestone cliffs still rise from the water as they did in 1941, still bearing that particular pale warmth in the afternoon light, still wrapped in the salt smell of the Black Sea. But the thunder that once came from the German siege guns, the extraordinary, terrible voice of weapons so large they reshaped the landscape, that thunder has dissolved into memory. Time has a peculiar way of doing this. It collects the thunder, presses it down, makes it smaller, not forgotten, never that, but softer, gentler to recall. When you walk the harbour today, if you were ever to walk it, you might pass monuments to those who held the line. There are photographs in small museums, images of faces young and lined, soldiers and sailors, and civilians whose names are recorded in registers that few now read. The city rebuilt itself in the decades after. Apartments rose where rubble had been stacked. Schools reopened. The Black Sea Fleet found new berths in the harbours. Children were born into peace, grew old into it, never knowing the sound of a bombardment that lasted not days but months. Is it possible to truly understand what your ancestors endured if you have not lived it? Perhaps not entirely. Yet the wanting to understand, the pilgrimage to a memorial or a preserved bunker, suggests something in us reaches backward through time, trying to touch that moment when humans endured beyond what seemed endurable. The siege itself lasted 9 months. 250 days of bombardment, of defenders pressed into fortifications they could not leave, of children evacuated in the dark, of submarine runs bringing supplies through minefields in waters lit by German flares. The German 11th Army, under Manstein's command, had come to break the city. They came with more guns than perhaps had ever been assembled for a single siege in human warfare. They came with determination and industrial power, and the terrible momentum of an empire trying to expand at all costs. And they did, in the end, break the defences. The city fell. Tens of thousands died, soldiers and civilians alike, in those 9 months. Soviet losses alone are estimated in the hundreds of thousands when one counts the dead and the missing and those who vanished into captivity. What does time do with such numbers, such sacrifice? It transforms them into weight, into history. The individual person, the sailor who manned a gun in Fort Maxim Gorky even as the shells fell around him, the schoolteacher who tried to keep children calm in an underground shelter, the nurse who moved between wounded in the darkness. These people fade from the individual into the collective. They become the siege, they become the symbol, and in a way, this may be the closest we can come to honouring them, not by forgetting the precise details, but by understanding that what they lived through was, in its scale and its intensity, beyond what most of us will ever face. And they faced it, day after day, month after month. There is something profound in the simple fact that a city can be destroyed and then rebuilt, that rubble can become streets again, that graves can be tended, that even after such trauma, life continues. Sevastopol is not the same city that fell in July of 1942. How could it be? Yet it carries something of that moment within it, the way we carry memories of our own trials. There are cracks in the foundation that mean something. There are streets that curve around where buildings once stood. There are names on plaques. The city remembers, even if the memory is encoded now in the physical rather than the lived. To endure is perhaps the most human of all struggles. Not to conquer, though conquest may be glorious in its moment, but to endure, to continue, to choose to rebuild rather than to abandon. The defenders of Sevastopol endured not because they believed they would win. Many of them must have known, particularly toward the end, that the city would fall. They endured because endurance was what was required of them in that moment. Because their sisters and brothers and parents and children were still in the city. Because the choice to stay was, in a strange way, the only choice that made any sense. The quiet that came after the siege was, one imagines, almost worse than the thunder. The absence of bombardment meant the war had moved elsewhere. It meant the defenders had not held. The silence of a fallen city is different from the silence of peace. It carries grief in it. It carries an echo of what was fought for and what was lost. Yet in time, even that silence becomes something else. It becomes a memory of grief rather than the fresh wound of it. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the harbour returns to its natural rhythm. The waves arrive and retreat. The light changes with the seasons. New people are born who have no direct memory of the siege, and then new people are born to them. When we think of the great sieges of history, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Sevastopol, we often focus on the moment of the siege itself, the terrible compression of suffering and endurance. But what strikes some historians, and perhaps should strike us, is what came after: the rebuilding, the choosing to stay in a place that has been so wounded, the slow healing of a landscape and a people. This is not the dramatic part of the story. There are no battles in the rebuilding. There is only the daily choosing to live, to work, to raise children, in a place that was nearly destroyed. The harbour at Sevastopol is quiet now. The fortifications remain, some of them preserved as museums or monuments. The streets carry their names. The water is still dark and deep, and wrapped in that particular Crimean light. Ships pass